Ukraine has permission to strike Russian targets inside Russian territory, meaning the world may be inching ever closer to World War III. At least, that's the impression that David Cameron, the UK's Foreign Secretary, gave with recent comments that appeared to give the green light to Ukraine. The Kremlin didn't react well. It believes that using Western weapons to strike targets inside Russia is an escalation of the war it started, and with that escalation, potential repercussions that could see Britain, along with several other NATO-aligned countries, dragged directly into the conflict. The question now is simple: what happens next? Will Ukraine actually start striking Russian targets inside Russia itself? Has it started doing so already, and if so, are Russia's claims of an escalation justified? Before we answer those questions, let's examine the comments that have led us to this situation. On May 3, 2024, David Cameron pledged to provide Ukraine with £3 billion of military aid, approximately $3.84 billion, per year, as long as it takes for that aid to help Ukraine win the war against Russia. That alone would have come as a blow to the Kremlin. Not only would Ukraine receive more help from the UK, which hasn't been shy about supporting the country since the beginning of the war, but the comments represent a long-term commitment. That $3.84 billion will come every year, with no political wrangling required to get it approved. But these weren't the comments that so infuriated the Kremlin. In addition to pledging the money, Cameron also said, "Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself." A somewhat ambiguous statement. Failing to look at the subtext here could even lead somebody to believe that Cameron is simply restating that Ukraine has the right to defend itself on its own territory, but that's not what he's saying. Prior to making this statement, the UK has generally made it clear that any of the weapons it provides should only be used on Ukrainian sovereign territory. That includes the Storm Shadow missile, which can travel for around 248 miles. Ukraine has used that missile to conduct several strikes in Russian-controlled Crimea, which fits the UK's description of sovereign territory. That much was made clear in February 2024, when the country's government released a statement on the 10th anniversary of Crimea's annexation. "We want to be clear that the UK will never recognize Russia's illegal claims to the region or to any Ukrainian territory, and that we will continue to do all we can to stop Putin's war machine and support Ukraine in their fight for as long as it takes." So Ukraine already had the green light to use British missiles in Crimea, but now it appears to have the green light to use them in Russia itself. Pay special attention to the "just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine" portion of Cameron's comments. They suggest that Britain is fine with Ukraine taking an eye for an eye approach with Russia. Just as Russia strikes in Ukraine, so can Ukraine strike in Russia. Cameron even made that aspect clear later when he said that Ukraine absolutely has the right to strike back at Russia. Britain isn't the only country that has permitted Ukraine to use the weapons it supplies on Russian territory. Politico reports that most countries providing aid to Ukraine since the war began have done so under the condition that Ukraine doesn't use any of the weapons they supply to attack Russia itself. That's changing. Both Latvia and Finland, countries that likely see themselves as potential targets for Russia if it succeeds in taking Ukraine, have since made similar comments to Cameron's. Ukraine has the right to use any weapons they supply to defend itself, which includes direct strikes inside Russia. Moscow's response was outraged. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesman for the Kremlin, called Cameron's comments another very dangerous statement, before going on to claim that they represented a direct escalation of the tension around the Ukrainian conflict. Chillingly, he added that such comments could pose a larger threat to European security if they weren't backpedaled. Cameron has taken nothing back. If anything, his comments appear to have emboldened others. On May 24, 2024, NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg took part in an interview with The Economist. Stoltenberg, who is coming to the end of his 10-year stint in the role, used the interview to claim that the time has come for Ukraine's allies to consider whether they should lift some of the restrictions they've placed on how Ukraine uses the weapons they supply. Some already have, as we've seen with Britain, Latvia and Finland. However, The Economist believes that Stoltenberg's comments may have been targeted toward the United States. It says his claims had a clear, if unnamed, target, with the US lifting its own restrictions potentially being a key factor in Ukraine's ability to defend itself against Russia. It gets worse for Vladimir Putin. A Sky News report from May 28th looked at the comments made by Poland's Foreign Minister, Radoslaw Sikorski, who believes that the country shouldn't rule out sending its troops into Ukraine. Those comments echo French President Emmanuel Macron's words in February. "We shouldn't rule it out. We should leave Putin guessing as to our intentions." Putin is watching his war with Ukraine slowly shift. In the past, he's been able to launch operations in Ukraine with no direct threat being posed to Russia, even though he understood that Ukraine was receiving weapons from overseas and those weapons were being used to kill Russian troops inside Ukraine. He knew that Russia itself was safe. Ukraine could only use those weapons to defend itself on its own territory. Now he's not so certain. He has several countries, France and Poland included, claiming that direct intervention inside Ukraine is a possibility. And with Britain, France and Latvia all approving the use of their weapons in Russia, as well as NATO's Secretary General placing pressure on the United States, it may only be a matter of time before Ukraine starts to target military installations in Russia itself. Putin's response shows just how much these recent developments concern him. Outside of using a Kremlin spokesperson to talk about how Britain's green light represents an unnecessary escalation of tensions within Europe, he has also directly threatened the United Kingdom. On May 6th, Reuters reported that Russia summoned the country's British ambassador, Nigel Casey, to its foreign ministry to lodge a formal complaint against Cameron's comments. For its part, Britain denied that Casey was summoned, instead saying he'd arrived for a diplomatic and pre-arranged meeting in which he would reinforce the UK's support for Ukraine. Russia still decided to use that meeting to make threats. The Foreign Ministry supposedly warned Casey that the use of any British weapons on Russian territory, even by Ukraine, would make Britain a de facto part of the conflict, and with that role comes the possibility that British military facilities, both in Ukraine and elsewhere, could be targeted. In case there was any doubt left, the Foreign Ministry went on to say the ambassador was called upon to reflect on the inevitable catastrophic consequences of such hostile steps by London and immediately refute the belligerent provocative statements of the head of the Foreign Office in the most decisive and unambiguous way. It's unlikely that Russia got what it wanted out of Casey. But it had delivered its message: allow Ukraine to use your weapons in Russia, and Russia will respond. If the threat wasn't clear enough from the Foreign Ministry's statement, it was made crystal clear when Putin ordered his military to hold battlefield nuclear weapons drills. That exercise began on May 21st, with Reuters reporting that Russian vehicles had started to gather in Russia's southern military district for the first phase of the drill. The district lies adjacent to Ukraine, with Russia apparently running exercises for the launch of tactical nuclear warheads. To make its point even clearer, Moscow has also involved Belarus in the drills, which is a Russian ally and a country that shares a border with Ukraine. Russia's foreign ministry even provided details about the drills Moscow ran. It said Russian troops were practicing obtaining what it calls special ammunition, essentially code for nuclear warheads, for Russia's Iskander missiles. They were also practicing equipping potential launch vehicles with those missiles, as well as covertly moving them to designated launch positions, presumably so they could be used to strike Ukraine. Aviation units also took part in the drill, with crews practicing how to fit nuclear warheads to Kinzhal hypersonic missiles before they fly into designated patrol areas. Again, a term that seemed like code for potential launching points. These weren't pre-planned drills. Russia's foreign ministry made that clear when it claimed that they should send a sobering signal to the West, specifically the United Kingdom, as well as what it sees as the puppets that the West controls in Ukraine. It added, "We hope these drills will cool the hotheads in Western capitals, while helping the countries that have provided the green light to Ukraine to realize the potential catastrophic consequences of the strategic risks they're generating." There's the word again, catastrophic. As devastating to Putin as Ukraine getting the okay to use British weapons on Russian soil may be, he's using it as an opportunity to showcase Moscow's power. These drills are a stark reminder to the UK, as well as Ukraine, that Russia has tactical nuclear warheads. They're also a reminder that its troops know how to launch those warheads and that Russia is a far stronger nuclear power than Britain. You could also consider the drills a veiled warning to the United States. Don't bow to NATO pressure, Putin may be telling the US. If you do, we may be forced to turn the Ukraine war into a nuclear conflict that will involve the US if you grant permission to use your weapons on Russian territory. The thing is, you could argue that Ukraine is already using Western weapons to strike Russia on Russian territory. Take Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil refineries as an example. Global Witness points out those attacks started in 2024, essentially allowing Ukraine to create a new front in the war. But it's also here where Ukraine starts to see pushback from its military allies. Though Ukraine considers those refineries to be legitimate military targets, not least because they're believed to supply Russia's military with fuel, the United States has urged Ukraine to halt the attacks. Not because the US is worried about the attacks angering Russia. Rather, the US doesn't want Russian oil refineries going offline to affect global oil prices. Global Witness claims that President Joe Biden is so set on keeping US oil prices stable during the November 2024 election campaign that he wants Ukraine to hold off on these attacks until after that campaign ends. America's Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin outlined this thought process in April 2024, claiming that any Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries would have a knock-on effect in terms of the global energy situation. His recommendation was that Ukraine focus attacks on tactical and operational targets, with Ukraine likely believing that those refineries fall into both categories, seeing as they're thought to be supplying Russian troops with fuel. Those attacks have also been effective. Ukraine struck two facilities during the first few months of 2024, Lukoil's Volgograd and Norsy factories. The latter is especially important. It provides about 11% of Russia's gasoline requirements, with Ukraine's drone strikes dropping its output by half. Attacks on the Volgograd factory resulted in fires breaking out, allowing Ukraine to claim a small victory against the largest petroleum products creating factory in Russia's southern border region. Worse yet for the US argument, court documents obtained by Global Witness show that both factories have signed contracts to supply the Russian military. Volgograd has a contract with Russia's Ministry of Defense dating back to 2018 to supply Moscow's military with oil products. The Norsy factory has a similar contract, in addition to one signed in 2020 that sees it providing jet fuel to the Federal Security Service. These are far from the only Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries within Russia. It's launched 12 in 2024 alone, flying in the face of America's politicized argument about avoiding such attacks because of their impact on oil prices. Still, the US response showcases how some Western nations have approached the concept of Ukraine attacking Russia on its own soil. Other attacks against Russia using Western weaponry are a little more complicated. For instance, does it count as an attack on Russian soil if Ukraine is attacking targets on the Russian side of the front line it shares with its enemy? Putin may think so. He regards all of Ukraine as Russian territory. Plus, his current desire for a ceasefire is on the condition that Russia essentially claims all of the territory it's captured from Ukraine thus far during the war. Following that logic, Ukraine's May 2024 attack on a Russian base in Luhansk could be considered a strike using Western weapons in Russian territory. The Sun reports that aerial images show Ukraine unleashing MGM-140 ATACMS missiles on Russian troops in a captured region of Luhansk. These missiles are devastating. Capable of reaching a top speed of 2,300 miles per hour, they have a range of around 186 miles and can carry a 500-pound warhead. But most notably, the missile essentially releases small bomblets upon detonating, allowing Ukraine to carpet a large area with explosions rather than unleashing a precise missile strike. Ukraine used that feature to its advantage in the Luhansk strike. Aerial footage analyzed by the Institute for the Study of War seems to show that the strikes targeted a Russian training ground, killing 116 troops. Another strike destroyed a launcher and charger in Russian-controlled territory, which Ukraine attacked with 6 of these missiles. There are also Ukraine's attacks on Sevastopol to consider. One of the most recent, a missile strike that struck 2 Russian landing ships and damaged infrastructure at the port in March 2024, demonstrates the level of attack Ukraine is willing to levy at Sevastopol. And again, we may see a territorial wrinkle at play here. Sevastopol is located in Crimea, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. To Putin, that means it's Russian territory, and any attack using Western weapons could constitute an attack on Russia itself. But to Ukraine, Sevastopol and the entire Crimea belong to Kyiv, with any attacks launched there simply being attempts to retake territory that it believes rightfully belongs to it. The point here is that it's easy to argue that Ukraine is already striking within Russian territory. That's certainly what it's doing with the oil refineries, though it's not confirmed if it's used Western weapons to make those strikes. It absolutely used American missiles in its attacks in Luhansk, if that strike was conducted on territory that Russia had taken during the war. The same goes for the attacks in Sevastopol. Russia claims ownership of the Crimea region, so Ukraine's strikes against Russia's navy there and in the Black Sea could be considered attacks in Russia. Yet Russia has only now started to warn of catastrophic consequences. Is that a response to the UK and other countries giving their tacit approval for Ukraine to attack Russia more directly? Or are the threats another case of Russian bluster that Putin is unlikely to follow through with? That question remains to be answered in the coming months. What can't be argued is that Russia's outrage at what it deems an escalation of the Ukraine war smacks of hypocrisy. Obviously, Russia started the war, meaning it's directly responsible for the escalation of tensions both with Ukraine and Europe at large. But that's not where the hypocrisy ends. Russia has also been more than willing to use weapons supplied by other countries on Ukrainian territory. Take its receipt of hundreds of Iranian-made drones in mid-2023 as an example. A Reuters report from June of that year says the US believes Russia has deepened its military cooperation with Iran by purchasing several hundred one-way attack drones to use in Ukraine. White House spokesperson John Kirby released a statement claiming that Russia has been using Iranian UAVs to strike Kyiv and terrorize the Ukrainian population. He concluded by pointing out that Russia and Iran's military partnership is deepening. The interesting twist here is that Iran acknowledges that it sent drones to Russia. However, it claims that any drones sent arrived in Moscow before the Ukraine war began. Russia also says that it hasn't used any Iranian drones during the conflict, and yet the US says both are lying. It claims Iranian drones have been flowing into Russia since at least August 2022, and the two countries are cooperating so deeply that Russia is building a special plant in its Alabuga Special Economic Zone to build more of the drones. This is all being done despite Western sanctions that are supposed to prevent Iran from supplying Russia. Russia using Iranian drones throws David Cameron's comments into a new light. Given Britain's close military ties with the United States, as well as the fact that these claims are publicly available, he likely knows that Iran is supplying Russia with weapons. He also knows those weapons are being used in Ukraine. That leads to the obvious argument: what's good for the goose is good for the gander. In other words, if Russia is attacking Ukraine with weapons it has sourced from international partners, there's no reason why Ukraine shouldn't be able to do the same. And Iran isn't the only country that's providing Russia with weapons. In February 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Russia and North Korea appear to have worked out a trade agreement. In return for food, North Korea has sent artillery shells, a staggering 3 million of them since September 2023. The report quotes South Korea's defense minister, Shin Won-sik, who says his country's intelligence teams have tracked the transfer of around 6,700 containers believed to collectively carry either millions of 152mm artillery shells or around 500,000 122mm rounds. Talking to the Yonhap news outlet, he says it could possibly be a mix of the two, and you can say that at least several million shells have been sent. In return, Russia has not only been sending food to North Korea, but has also provided it with raw materials it can use when building other weapons. But just as it did with the reports of buying Iranian drones, Russia denies that it's receiving artillery shells from North Korea. Ukraine disputes that. A May 2024 BBC report suggests that Ukraine's military believes that not only is North Korea supplying Russia with artillery shells, but it's also delivering missiles. And those missiles have been fired in the dozens, injuring more than 70 people and killing at least 24. Russian hypocrisy rears its head again, and the list goes on. In April 2023, Reuters reported on Ukrainian claims that the country's military is increasingly finding Chinese components in weapons Russia is using in the country. Speaking in a video call, Vladislav Vlasiuk, who is an advisor for Ukraine's chief of staff, said, "The trend is now that there are less Western-made components but more, not hard to guess which country, made components. Of course, China." Such components were found in all and aerial drones, apparently used to replace the Swiss-made navigation systems those drones use, as well as in the fire control systems used in Russian tanks. The situation with China is a little different from that with Iran and North Korea. China has consistently denied providing weapons to Russia, a claim that appears to be backed by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Speaking to the BBC in April 2024, he said, "What's not happening is the provision of actual arms by China to Russia for use in Ukraine. Instead, China has been much more subtle," Blinken says, by providing critical components Russia can use to build up its war machine. He added that around 90% of the microelectronics Russia imports and likely uses in the war come from China, as do 70% of the machine tools used in its factories, just as Ukraine claimed in 2023. The threat of sanctions placed against China is designed to slow down this trade. But the point, as is the case with Iran and North Korea, remains. Russia is getting help from overseas powers to attack Ukraine. In essence, Russia already appears to be doing precisely what it's telling Ukraine it can't do, using weapons supplied by other countries to attack another country's territory. For Ukraine, this simply means that using its Western-made weapons to strike Russia would be leveling the playing field, all of which brings us to a final question. Now that Ukraine essentially has permission to use British weapons in Russia, will it actually do so? The odds are high that it will. After all, Zelensky has renewed his calls for Ukraine's Western allies to allow the use of their weapons in Russia, most recently during a joint press conference he held with Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez on May 27th. "We need to intensify our joint work with our partners to achieve more. Security and tangible coercion of Russia to peace by all means," he said before adding, "Even those partners who are afraid to give this or that advice should understand that air defense is defense, not attack." In other words, Ukraine wants to use the F-16s and missiles it's receiving from its Western partners to retaliate against the 3,000 Russian aerial bombs flying into Ukraine from Russian territory. Jens Stoltenberg also renewed his calls for Ukraine's NATO allies to allow the use of their weapons on Russian territory. He reinforced what Zelensky said, pointing out that Russian forces are attacking from their own territory behind the front line. Much of that front line, he says, essentially runs along the border between Ukraine and Russia. If you cannot attack Russian forces on the other side of the front line because they are on the other side of the border, then of course you really reduce the ability of the Ukrainian forces to defend themselves. That comment may offer some insight into the nature of the strikes Ukraine wants to use on Russia. It's not looking to fire missiles at Moscow. Instead, Ukraine simply wants the opportunity to attack Russian positions supporting troops on the front line, even if those positions are within Russian territory. The UK has granted permission for it to do so. Will the United States follow? Let us know what you think, and tell us what impact Ukraine having permission to launch attacks within Russian territory, at least from a handful of its partners, will have on the war. We look forward to checking out your comments, and thank you for watching the video. Ukraine is about to receive a revolutionary weapon system that could redefine drone warfare: the Australian-developed Slinger. You've seen the devastating impact of drones in countless news reports and social media videos, wreaking havoc on buildings, vehicles, soldiers, and infrastructure. The Slinger system promises to turn the tide in the battle against swarms of low-tech lethal drones. But what makes the system so special? How does it work? And why is it so desperately needed on the Ukrainian front lines? Stay with us as we uncover the cutting-edge technology behind the Slinger, its unparalleled capabilities, and the strategic advantage it offers Ukraine in this high-stakes conflict. But to understand how the Slinger can turn the tide in Ukraine, let's first delve into its impressive technical specifications and capabilities. Developed by Australian defense company Electro-Optic Systems, the Slinger counter-drone system offers an elegantly simple yet highly effective solution to a complex problem. Weighing just over 700 pounds, this self-contained unit is a formidable drone killer. Its primary weapon, a 30mm M230LF Bushmaster chain gun, is complemented by a Belgian-made FN Mag 58 7.62 caliber machine gun. With a 150-round ammunition drum for the chain gun and customizable belted ammunition for the machine gun, the Slinger is ready for action. If fired simultaneously, the chain gun can shoot up to 200 rounds a minute, and the FN Mag 58 can shoot around 650 to 1,000 rounds per minute. That's quite a bit of lead going downrange toward a cheap quadcopter. But that's not all the Slinger can do. Beyond its robust armament, the Slinger boasts cutting-edge detection technology that ensures no drone goes unnoticed. Equipped with advanced detection tools, the Slinger can pinpoint potential drone threats with precision. Its four-dimensional sensor unit continuously emits lasers to measure distances accurately, working in tandem with its primary radar to find, fix, track, and destroy enemy drones. At the heart of the Slinger is the American-made EchoGuard electronically scanned array radar. This revolutionary radar system, typically found in much larger, standalone units, has been miniaturized for compact use. The EchoGuard excels in finding, classifying, and tracking targets of virtually any size under almost any weather. Utilizing unique onboard software capabilities that assist the EchoGuard in differentiating even the smallest and fastest moving of targets, little can escape its gaze. But how does the radar work? As a phased array radar, it sends energy pulses in one direction at a time. These pulses coincide with the maximum area of coverage the radar can see and happen so fast it can give data throughout its whole field of view as close as possible to real time. For the EchoGuard, it operates in the K-band frequency range of 24.05 and 24.65 GHz. This incredibly high frequency range is great for producing high-fidelity data at short ranges, just what the Slinger needs to do. In addition to having this great data while tracking enemy drones, the operator can set the radar to a 10 Hz search while tracking function even while the Slinger is engaging a target. This is a very valuable capability, since it allows the operator not to get sucked into the current problem and able to look ahead for the next threat constantly. Another great feature of this radar is its field of view. With the ability to scan up to 80 degrees high in the air with a 120-degree cross-section, the Echo Guard radar can provide more than enough coverage for the slinger's own field of view, which is up to 70 degrees straight up and 10 degrees down. But how does the gun stay on target when shooting from a moving platform? Thanks to a gimbal system, the slinger can stay on target no matter the shooter's speed or drone speed to within 1 milliradian. A milliradian is 1,000th of a radian, the angle that intercepts an arc equal to the circle's radius. In plain language, this means that the margin of error for the slinger is so small, it's almost not even measurable. But how far can the slinger really see? EOS testing data reveals that the slinger can detect targets over 12,000 meters away with its daylight camera and more than 13,700 meters with its thermal imaging camera. While this information is sufficient for radar registration, high-quality firing solutions are achieved within 5,600 meters for daylight and 5,100 meters for thermal imaging. For higher quality data that can be used to actually shoot something down, a potential drone would need to fly within 5,600 meters of the daylight camera and 5,100 meters of the thermal imager. Once inside this range, the slinger can begin engaging the target since the operator has enough information to know the drone's bearing, range, and speed. If the drone closes another 500 meters, the operator can even tell the exact make, model, and type of drone. However, drones are only one of the targets the slinger can engage. Because of the multi-threat environment in which the slinger system will operate, drones are not the only adversaries the operator might need to contend with. From operational testing of the system, the slinger can accurately detect and engage vehicles at distances of over 3.5 kilometers, enemy soldiers at 2.2 kilometers, and some of the most common, smallest quadcopters at distances of just over a kilometer. Rounding out the slinger system's main parts are a few other sensors and pieces of equipment that help it to operate. One of these is a wind sensor mounted on the top right of the unit that continually feeds wind data into the slinger's algorithm. Controlling the slinger is a 50-pound control unit situated inside the vehicle. This control unit is almost like a video game, where a user can accurately find, fix, and engage targets with the push of a button. Now that we've gone over a good bit of the technical details of the system, the question still remains of how the slinger is so effective at shooting down small drones. The answer to that question is not what you think. Before Electro-Optic Systems became a defense company, it was a trailblazer in Australia's space industry, pioneering the best way to track objects in near-Earth orbit up to 36,000 kilometers. But how are they able to do this, and why track objects in space? According to recent data, there are more than 29,000 pieces of space debris larger than 10 centimeters, 670,000 more than a centimeter, and a staggering 170 million pieces of space junk larger than a millimeter. And all of this space junk is not just standing still. All the debris is flying around in near-Earth orbit at speeds of around 18,000 miles per hour, about 7 times that of a bullet. When combined with the fact that around 6,000 satellites are orbiting the Earth at any given time, keeping track of this enormous amount of space debris becomes a big issue. Even the smallest piece of junk hitting one of these satellites could be catastrophic. EOS came into the field to help solve this problem. Founded about 40 years ago, the company has become Australia's and one of the world's leading experts in tracking small, fast-moving objects around the Earth. While the company does a lot of research to explore deep space, the primary focus has been crafting cutting-edge lasers and optics that can measure these very small but extremely fast-moving objects within 1 millimeter of accuracy. Because of the decades of experience in doing this line of work, it's no wonder that Slinger was a natural transition for the company to go from space exploration to defense products. Essentially, the technology on Slinger has been in development for decades in the space industry, and the company is now miniaturizing this technology to become a drone's worst nightmare. But of course, the company needs more than just powerful lasers and cool optics to track this fast space debris. It also needs extremely powerful software programs. While the exact capabilities of Electro-Optic Systems' computer algorithms are kept under wraps as a company secret, they are without a doubt powerful. After all, with their lasers tracking tens of millions and potentially more than 100 million objects at any given time of the day, the amount of data that the company is processing is, for lack of a better word, astronomical. To then be able to take this massive amount of raw data, sort it, process it, and then have a usable product in real time within a millimeter of accuracy takes some serious computing power. For Slinger, this software is at the heart of its capabilities. With the ability to intake a huge amount of data from its Echo Guard radar, Slinger then needs to make sense of this information on very small, fast-moving targets in real time for the operator to actually engage them. But how is Slinger adapted from a cool science project to military use? According to press releases from the company, the beauty of the Slinger is that it can be modified to practically anything with wheels. while the official contract Ukraine signed for 160 units has 110 being fitted to M113 armored personnel carriers and 50 going to Bushmaster 4x4 trucks, the Slinger can be fitted to almost any type of vehicle. When EOS showed off Slinger's capabilities at the firing range with live drones, operators fired the unit from Denali pickup trucks. With the ability to turn everything from a simple pickup truck to an armored vehicle to a tank into a mobile drone point defense system, Slinger's utility is really only limited by the operator's imagination. So why is the Slinger really needed in Ukraine? Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the type of fighting has been ever-changing. Due to the absolutely massive casualties the Russians suffered in both terms of soldiers and material, they began looking for ways to preserve their combat power. As for Ukraine, since they've remained the underdog in this fight from the beginning, across all metrics like number of personnel, equipment, and economy size, they too have sought to expand their combat power in a realistic way. In the end, both sides ended up choosing drones to meet their respective needs. But how bad has drone warfare gotten? According to reports from the battlefield, the use of drones has become absolutely critical to how both sides fight this war. They perform a wide variety of functions on both sides. The first and most obvious of these is reconnaissance. Both Russia and Ukraine have bought or developed their own reconnaissance drones. This is because of the depth of Ukraine's air defenses and the strength of Russia's air force. Neither side can get an advantage in the skies. Because of this, both sides rely heavily on reconnaissance drones, since if they get shot down, it's much better price to pay than a multi-million-dollar aircraft and pilot. While reconnaissance drones like Ukraine's UKR jet or Russia's Orlan do a lot of the long-range reconnaissance that is then fed back to higher headquarters, both sides also use larger attack drones. Russia has famously buddied up with Iran to procure thousands of so-called kamikaze Shahid drones, which are meant as one-time use drones that fly at fast speeds and pack a huge punch. To date, Russia has employed more than 4,000 such drones in its illegal conquest of Ukraine. Ukraine has also developed or procured a wide variety of armed drones. Most famously, it's used the Turkish-made Bayraktar drone and the domestically produced UKR jet UJ-22 biplane. But while these attack drones and loitering munitions have played a huge part in the fighting, their use is underscored by an even bigger threat: first-person view drones. Known for short as FPV drones, these small drones are the true menace on the battlefields of Ukraine. They serve various functions. The first of these roles is to serve as local reconnaissance drones. With a range of 5 to 20 kilometers, these small drones are perfect for local company-sized units to have their own intelligence-gathering tool at all hours of the day. In addition to this role, both Ukrainian and Russian artillery units use FPV drones to help spot their fires. While traditionally a forward observer would be embedded with forward units to report what he saw, now a forward observer can get a top-down view in real time and correct fires without playing a game of telephone on the radio. But despite these advantages, the true terror in FPV drones comes in their bomb-dropping capabilities. Both sides employ huge drone manufacturing capabilities dedicated to making small FPV drones or using money to buy civilian quadcopters on the open market. Dotted across Ukraine are hundreds of ad hoc factories set up in abandoned homes, hospitals, and bunkers where Ukrainian volunteers use a variety of methods to not only cobble together FPV drones from open-source parts, but also modify munitions like anti-tank grenades, regular hand grenades, RPG warheads, and mortar shells so they're able to be dropped from these small drones. For Russia's part, they too have hundreds if not thousands of factories both inside occupied Ukraine and inside Russia producing FPV drones on a similar scale. To put some of the numbers into perspective, the Ukrainian government has set a target of 1 million FPV drones to be domestically produced in the country in 2024. This number does not include the huge numbers of FPV drones Ukraine buys on the open market or that are donated by allied countries every day. Both sides of the conflict use FPV drones for a variety of purposes. They use them to target and take out tanks, artillery pieces, armored vehicles, and worst of all, harass and kill unsuspecting individual soldiers anytime, anywhere. Due to the complete proliferation of FPV drones, coming up with ways to take them out has been a priority for Ukraine. But this has been easier said than done. While Ukraine has been provided with some of the West's most capable anti-air systems, they are not necessarily the best choice for taking out drones. For example, the US Patriot and NASAMS systems, along with European weapons like the Iris-T, are all incredibly powerful, accurate, and versatile anti-air defenses. The only problem is, they're costly to operate. With a unit cost running into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per missile, every time Ukraine fires the weapon, there could be millions of dollars spent per engagement. When firing against Shahid drones with a unit cost in the tens of thousands of dollars, or worse, against an FPV drone with a price in the thousands or even hundreds of dollars, using these highly capable air defense systems is a sunken cost fallacy that Ukraine is on the wrong side of. To counteract wasting precious ammunition on drones meant to exhaust Ukraine's missile supplies and stop the flow of expensive Western aid into the war zone, Ukraine's Western backers have provided a variety of other anti-air systems that the country has put to good use. For example, Germany's legacy Gepard and newer Skynex air defense systems have been donated and proven useful on the battlefield. Utilizing high-capacity autocannons to shoot down short-range, fast-moving targets, these vehicles have downed significant numbers of drones. However, at only around 50 total units operational, these are just a drop in the bucket for what's needed. Ukraine's Western backers have also provided a variety of other air defense systems explicitly geared for drone defense. For example, Lithuania has donated thousands of Skywiper electronic drone mitigation systems. These small portable units are great for point defense of local units that can keep them in a vehicle or trench due to weighing just 14 pounds. The Skywiper works by jamming the radio frequency signals the operator sends to control the drone. But while these systems are great for protecting smaller areas within 3 miles, visible drones outside this range are not susceptible to their effects. Even worse, due to the increased number of GPS jammers on the battlefield, Russia has been hardening its own weapons to become even more jam-resistant, lessening the usefulness of such tools. Another counter-drone system that Ukraine has utilized is the Terrahawk Paladin counter-drone system. Adapted from MSI's Navy variant for land use, the Terrahawk is very similar to Germany's Skynex. Utilizing a powerful autocannon, it's designed to perform point defense in an area of up to 3 kilometers, using its own radar suite. However, unlike Skynex, the Terrahawk is a static weapon, meaning it cannot move on its own and is very vulnerable to enemy counterfire. Ukraine has also not received very many of this system either. The US has also donated several drone defense weapons, including the new Vampire by L3 Harris. Of all the donated drone defense weapons, the Vampire is the most similar to the Slinger. It is its own self-contained unit fully equipped with radar and a control unit that can be mounted onto most pickup trucks. But unlike the Slinger, the Vampire has a 4-rocket pod that can fire 70mm guided rockets or similar munitions. However, despite being very similar, price and capacity are the main drawbacks. At $27,500 per rocket, the Vampire is still on the wrong side of the math equation when shooting down drones worth $500 each. Additionally, with just 4 rockets, a Vampire system could quickly run out of ammunition in a real fight where multiple drones are coming from different angles of attack. Lastly, reloading this weapon while under fire is no easy task, and when out of ammunition, the operator would likely have to egress the area to reload and get back in the fight. As one can see, though Ukraine has received a lot of Western aid, no single system can yet meet the cost-effectiveness and versatility needed when shooting down swarms of FPV drones. So what are the advantages of the Slinger over some of these systems? Arguably, one of the Slinger's best advantages is the cost. Firing 30mm and 7.62mm rounds, the Slinger can engage a huge number of drones for about a couple of $100 to $1,000 per engagement. Compared to the hundreds of thousands of dollars of some of the advanced systems, the Slinger finally gets Ukraine on the right side of the cost equation. Another pro is that the Slinger is very adaptable to whatever platform the Ukrainians need it to go on. Currently, larger air defense systems like the Patriot come with several modules, including the firing unit, radar, command post, and other containers. These containerized systems cannot move quickly on the battlefield. For other legacy systems like Gepard and Skynex, these systems can cost millions of dollars, plus have expensive maintenance to keep the vehicles operational. Additionally, getting a replacement in the field is tough if the vehicle takes any substantial battle damage. On the other hand, Slinger is much more versatile, in that it can be mounted on a pickup truck, tank, or armored personnel carrier, or in a static position. With the ability to quickly displace and be replaced due to its low cost of around $1 million, the Slinger beats out the other mobile platforms. Because the Slinger system is so small, its radar cross-section and energy are much lower than those of other air defense systems. Countries like Russia have developed a wide range of emission-seeking munitions that look for radar energy from an air defense site and home in on it. However, because the energy output from this system only goes a few kilometers and is very small, when operating, Slinger is practically invisible to Russian aircraft unless they are right over the top, which would be a whole other problem in and of itself. But despite these pros, there are a few disadvantages to the system that could eventually give the Russians a way to defeat it. One way is its ability to integrate into Ukraine's overall air defense network. Due to the limited range of its radar, the firing unit would have to be able to share data with assets that have a longer range in order to be forewarned for incoming attacks. Not having this capability to share data can leave operators vulnerable and surprised by massed Russian attacks. This ties directly into the Slinger's next con. In Ukraine, it's been increasingly common for Russia to employ ever-increasing numbers of drones in multi-axis attacks against Ukrainian positions. Though the live-fire demonstrations in Australia were impressive, it should be noted that these were all single drone engagements. Though Slinger could very well encounter single FPV drones since they're so common, it's increasingly more common to see multiple drones at one time. How Slinger will fare against these multi-threat engagements may only be known when Ukraine uses it on the battlefield. But despite these cons, Slinger will undoubtedly be a game-changer on the battlefield, filling a hole in Ukraine's air defense network. But what do you think? Do you think the Slinger will change the dynamics of drone warfare on the battlefield? Let us know in the comments below. Also, tell us what other military technologies you're interested in learning about. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more expert military analysis and updates. On April 13, 2024, Iran launched a barrage of attacks against Israel, sending over 300 drones and cruise and ballistic missiles its way. Yet not a single drone or cruise missile managed to enter Israeli airspace. For the most part, Israel has its multi-layered air defense system to thank for this extraordinary success rate. Still, the country wouldn't have been able to pull off this remarkable achievement without a hastily assembled coalition, including the US and the UK, which helped shoot down Iranian drones over Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. The speed and effectiveness at which allies came together to protect Israel brought one question to the forefront: why can't the same level of coordination and support be extended to Ukraine? Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was the first to pose the question, shortly followed by the German parliament, the famous Bundestag. In a rare feat, both the leading and opposing parties in the Bundestag were in favor of deploying the NATO integrated air defense system to protect Ukrainian airspace. But how would this protection work? Would Germany be the only country to commit resources? And why does Ukraine need so much help in the first place? These are just some of the questions we'll answer as this video progresses. But first, let's see how this important idea started brewing in Germany. The German parliament members, MPs, were actually the first to put this idea forward. It initially came from German military experts like Nico Lange, a senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference, and Lieutenant General Heinrich Braus, a former NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning. However, it's the Bundestag that has the power to turn this idea into reality, so it shouldn't be surprising that the proposal only gained significant traction when taken up by German parliament members. As mentioned, and as reported by Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, a German media outlet, both the members of the ruling liberal-left coalition, the Greens and the Free Democratic Party, as well as the members of the opposing Christian Democratic Union, supported the idea of deploying NATO air defense systems to protect Ukrainian airspace. Here's what MPs from these parties had to say on the matter. Markus Faber of the Free Democratic Party discussed the feasibility of Ukrainian protection plans in the long run. He pointed out that there's currently a limited number of air defense systems and missiles available. So according to Faber, step one would be securing a sufficient number of these systems. Only then should the Western allies fully commit to protecting the Ukrainian skies. Roderich Kiesewetter of the Christian Democratic Union explained what kind of effect this commitment would have on Ukraine. According to him, shooting down Russian drones over Ukraine would ease the burden on the Ukrainian air defense and allow it to protect the front. And given how forcefully Russia has been attacking that front in recent times, Ukraine can't afford to miss any opportunity to strengthen its defenses. But how would this strengthening even work? Agnieszka Brugger, the deputy chair of the Greens, explained which part of the Ukrainian airspace could be protected by NATO, as well as which countries should be part of this endeavor. In her words, the air defense systems should be deployed on the borders of countries that border Ukraine, so that they could also protect Ukraine's western regions. Anton Hofreiter, the chairman of the German Committee on European Affairs and a member of the same party, further specified which countries could be expected to help protect Ukraine in the long run. According to Hofreiter, Ukrainian airspace could be protected by systems located on the territory of Poland and Romania. The plan is to establish a safe zone extending some 43 miles into the Ukrainian territory and protect this zone using the NATO Integrated Air Defense System units stationed in these two countries. The NATO Integrated Air and Missile Defense System, NATINAMS for short, is a command and control network that combines the radar, missile systems, and aircraft of NATO member countries to ensure comprehensive air defense coverage and coordination. The Center Allied Air Command of all NATO member countries in Europe is based at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which coordinates centers spread all over the continent. Both Romania and Poland house an air operations center, the former in Balotesti and the latter in Poland, Warsaw Pry. Both countries also have a rather developed complex of radar stations, which makes them ideal candidates for helping to protect Ukrainian airspace. As far as their equipment goes, the Polish Air Force boasts the Backbone system, comprised of 3 NUR-12M and 3 RAT-31DL long-range radars, while the Romanian Air Force possesses 5 ANFPS-117 air search radars distributed across 5 radar stations. But as you probably know, radars alone aren't enough to ensure effective air defense. That's why additional air defense systems would have to be set up on the territory of these two countries. For now, we can only speculate on what these systems might be based on the model used for this proposal, the Iranian attack on Israel. With this in mind, let's look at how this attack unfolded and, more importantly, how it was thwarted. Sometime after midnight on April 13th, the Israeli air raid alerts blasted through the night. Citizens were urged to seek shelter as explosions erupted in the distance. The reason for these alerts lay in the 170 drones, 110 ballistic missiles, and 30 cruise missiles launched by Iran, targeting strategic locations throughout Israel. However, the explosions echoing through the air weren't the sounds of these missiles and drones hitting their target. No, they were the sounds of successful interceptions. Only a handful of the 110 ballistic missiles managed to reach the country, while none of the 170 drones and 30 cruise missiles had the chance. This was made possible by the swift reaction of several countries. The projectiles were fired from Iran's territory, as well as Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. They were intercepted and downed by Israel, the US, the UK, and Jordan. Let's start with Israel. As part of the first line of defense, the country sent the F-35 combat fighters to intercept the projectiles. This was possible due to the fact that most of the projectiles were sent from relatively far away. The shortest distance from Iran to Israel is about 620 miles and includes the airspaces of Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. With this swift action, Israel was able to take out 25 of the 30 cruise missiles outside the country. For any projectile that managed to slip through the first line of defense, Israel used the Aerial Defense Array, a newly installed national air defense system. The system in question has been in place since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7, 2023, and it consists of 3 layers. Layer number 1, the Arrow Missile Defense. The highest tier of the Aerial Defense Array was used to physically intercept long-range ballistic missiles, and it did so successfully, primarily relying on the Arrow 3 exo-atmospheric hypersonic anti-ballistic missiles. Layer number 2, the David's Sling. The middle tier of the Aerial Defense Array was employed to take out short-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, downing them as far as 186 miles away from Israel. Layer number 3, the Iron Dome system. This system is the reason why none of the 170 drones fired by Iran reached Israeli airspace, let alone any of their targets. Though this system was initially designed to protect cities and strategic sites against unguided rockets, it's recently been upgraded to take out drones as well, a decision that has obviously saved the day in Israel. So that's how Israel alone defended its territory against the incoming threat, but what about the allies? According to US President Joe Biden, the US forces helped Israel take down nearly all drones and missiles launched on that fateful Friday. The US Central Command, CENTCOM, went into more detail. According to CENTCOM, its forces took out over 80 drones and at least 6 ballistic missiles, some of which, 1 missile and 7 drones, were destroyed before they were even launched from the Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. Others were downed over southern Syria, with air defense systems deployed from undisclosed bases in the region. 2 aircraft and 2 destroyers that the US moved to the region before the Iranian attacks also helped, shooting down 4 to 6 ballistic missiles. But as helpful as these counterattacks were, they weren't the most significant contribution to the Israeli defensive operation. The US intelligence was. The intricate command and control system set up between the US, Israel, and some Arab neighboring countries provided extremely precise intelligence that essentially helped Israel neutralize all the threats coming its way. So the US did its fair share in defending Israel. What about the UK? The UK also rose to the occasion, sending Royal Air Force Typhoon combat jets to shoot down a number of Iranian drones. As for Jordan, you might be surprised to see this country among the nations helping down threats coming for Israel, given how critical Jordan was of the Israeli actions against Hamas in Gaza. However, Jordan didn't do it for the sake of protecting Israel, despite having a peace treaty with the country. It did it to protect its citizens, as a number of Iranian missiles and drones entered Jordanian airspace. Remember, Jordan was a part of the shortest route from Iran to Israel. For this endeavor, Jordan relied on its advanced radar systems, air-to-air missiles, and F-16 supersonic fighter jets, which proved extremely useful, even at night. France was also involved in the conflict, but there's no official information on whether the country downed any drones or missiles. For now, all that's known is that it helped patrol Israeli airspace. Given how comprehensive the response to the Iranian attacks was, it shouldn't be surprising that only 5 ballistic missiles managed to evade air defenses and impact Israeli territory. 4 of them landed in the Air Force base housing the Israeli F-35 fighter jets, the very same jets used to defend Israel against Iran. The only missile that did any damage hit a runway. The others hit hangars which were either empty or out of use. The 5th ballistic missile did manage to reach Israel, but it didn't reach its intended target, a radar site in the north of the country. So there you have it, a masterclass on how a well-coordinated and multi-layered air defense system, supported by international collaboration and advanced technology, can effectively neutralize a significant missile and drone threat. So what's the issue? Why can't the same be done in Ukraine? Well, for starters, Ukraine's air defense system doesn't even come close to the sophistication and integration of Israel's air defense network. This rang true even before the Russian invasion, but the conflict has further exacerbated the challenges. As Zelensky put it, Ukraine lacks the sufficient air defense equipment to protect the country against the Russian terror. However, he also declared that another, more important element was missing for this defense: the world's determination to protect Ukraine and stand up against Russia in the skies. That's the reason Zelensky asked for Allied help to protect the Ukrainian airspace in the first place. As he pointed out, neither Israel nor Ukraine are NATO member countries. So if NATO allies can help protect Israel against missiles and drones, what stops them from doing the same for Ukraine? Unfortunately, the answer is rather simple: a fear of drawing NATO into a war against Russia. Though the Israeli scenario demonstrated that NATO allies can interfere without joining the conflict, it seems that the situation in Ukraine is viewed through a different geopolitical lens. That's why the US and the UK outright refuse to commit any resources to guarding the Ukrainian airspace. As John Kirby, the White House National Security Council Strategic Communications Coordinator, explained the US's refusal to help Ukraine in 7 words: different conflicts, different airspace, different threat patterns. Though he did add that President Biden always made it clear that the US had no plans to directly engage in the conflict in Ukraine. The country is, however, Ukraine's #1 military aid provider by a margin, which means the US provides Ukraine with the necessary weapons to protect its airspace, and this is no small feat. As for the UK, the country's Foreign Secretary David Cameron was a bit more direct when addressing the UK's refusal to help Ukraine shoot down Russian drones. In an interview with LBC, a UK radio station, he outright said that the reason for the refusal lies in the fear of escalating the conflict into a direct confrontation with Russia. His exact words were, "If you want to avoid an escalation in terms of a wider European war, I think the one thing you need to do is avoid NATO troops directly engaging Russian troops. That will be a danger of escalation." Cameron added that using fighter jets to down drones, as the UK did in Israel, isn't always the best option. Air defense systems are more effective. In other words, Ukraine needs air defense systems and not fighter jets. The UK lacks the former, or at least the systems that would make the biggest change, the Patriot surface-to-air missile system. However, a lack of sufficient air defense systems isn't the only reason why Ukraine is desperately asking Germany and other NATO allies for help. The problem also lies in the proliferation of Russian drones. Russia was somewhat slow to adapt drone technology, but it's now making up for it by growing its fleet at an unprecedented rate. This particularly applies to the so-called kamikaze drones, a kind of aerial weapon designed to loiter around a target until it's located and then attack it by crashing into it. Russia is going all out on these drones. At first, Russia imported them from Iran, opting for the country's Haysa Shahed 136 models. In 2 years, Russia has imported thousands of these drones and fired over 4,600 of them. With a reported weight of about 440 pounds, they fly as fast as 115 miles per hour and have a flying range between 620 and 1,550 miles. Though the Shahed 136 drones were believed to be extremely cheap for unmanned aerial vehicle technology, a leaked correspondence suggests that Russia has been paying between 193,000 and 290,000 per drone. The former figure applies to batches of 6,000 drones, while the latter is for batches of 2,000 drones bought. That's likely why Russia has set up domestic production facilities that allow it to be substantially less dependent on Iranian drones. According to reports, Russia plans to produce 6,000 of these drones domestically by the summer of 2025. And the more drones that are produced, the more will be launched against Ukrainian targets, depleting the country's anti-drone ammunition. To make matters worse, Russia has also been experimenting with modifying the Shahed 136 to make them even more destructive. Some of these experiments include spraying drones to reduce detection and adding cameras to enhance reconnaissance capabilities. Though these modifications are yet to make any change in the Russian war effort, they serve as a concerning reminder that Russia will stop at nothing to advance its military capabilities and crush Ukrainian resistance. These incessant efforts also include working with Iran on developing new attack drones specifically for the war in Ukraine. The drones, cited as a huge concern for Ukraine, are described as explosive and reconnaissance drones that could potentially seek out high-value targets, including the US and UK multiple launch rocket systems used on the Ukrainian battlefields. The Shahed 107 drones, as they are called, are roughly 8 feet long, can be launched from a vehicle, and have a flying range of up to 930 miles. Another testament to the Russian "the end justifies the means" mentality is the fact that the country has children producing its drones. Yep, you heard that correctly. Activists from the cyber resistance group published a series of documents that prove that the previously mentioned Shahed 136 combat drones are manufactured by underage civilians enrolled in the Alabuga Polytech College in the Alabuga Special Economic Zone. In 2024 alone, these unexpected manufacturers are expected to produce 10,000 drone units. To reach this staggering number, over 500 students have been allocated to the drone production project. That's roughly 40% of the total number of students enrolled in 2023, which was 1,209. These students are engaged in various fields of manufacturing, including electric installation, industrial robotics, and numerical control programming. Given Russia's unscrupulous but unyielding efforts in the drone department, it shouldn't be surprising Ukraine needs all the help it can get in the skies. Though to be fair, Ukraine boasts pretty impressive interception rates, given the threat it faces every day. But when it comes to suicide drones, only a 100% interception rate would be considered satisfactory. Why? Because even if a single drone reaches its target, it can unleash devastation and take many lives in the process. Worst of all, the Ukrainian success rate at intercepting drones is gradually decreasing. The first few months of 2024 have been particularly challenging, as Ukraine has stretched its air defense units to their limits, facing an onslaught of Russian drones hitting cities with deadly accuracy and frequency, and Ukraine has only managed to shoot down about 82% of them. This begs the question, how low will this rate go before the Western allies interfere? As things stand, Ukraine can only defend itself against these deadly attacks with their help. The help in question could come in two forms. Number one, the Allies can supply more air defense systems to Ukraine, prioritizing models designed to intercept drones. Number two, the Allies could get involved more directly. They can support Ukrainian efforts to strike crucial targets like air bases, manufacturing facilities, and drone storage sites within Russia. After all, destroying Russian drones before they're even launched is the most effective way to protect Ukraine from the devastation they cause. The second approach also includes downing the already launched drones, which is what NATO essentially did for Israel. So will Ukraine be as lucky as Israel anytime soon? As things currently stand, the answer is unfortunately no, well, at least as far as the second, more direct approach goes. You see, the German proposal to use NATO-integrated air defense systems to protect Ukrainian airspace has been rejected by the ruling party, the Social Democratic Party. Why? For the same reasons the US and UK refuse to help Ukraine. It's simply too dangerous. To quote the head of the Social Democratic Party, Rolf Mützenich, protecting Ukrainian airspace via a NATO deployment would go against the principle of not becoming actively engaged in the war. Mützenich used two simple words to describe what this proposal could be: fire hazard. And the fire in question could consume not just Ukraine, but NATO as well. However, it's highly unlikely German MPs will just give up on the idea. After all, we're talking about a country that has helped Ukraine massively since the beginning of Russian aggression, so much so that it's become the second largest provider of military aid to the country. A great deal of this aid has also been focused on the Ukrainian Air Force specifically. Here's a brief overview of all the air defense systems Germany sent to Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. 9 TRML-4D air surveillance radars, 2 Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 52 Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns with spare parts, 146,000 rounds of ammunition for the Gepard guns, 4,000 rounds of practice ammunition for self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, 500 Stinger man-portable air defense systems, 2,700 Strela man-portable air defense systems, 3 IRIS-T SLM and 1 IRIS-T SLS air defense system with missiles, and 2 Patriot air defense systems with missiles and spare parts. And that's not all. As of May 2024, Germany plans to further raise these numbers by sending another Patriot air defense system and more Patriot missiles, 2 more Skynex air defense systems with ammunition, 9 more IRIS-T SLM systems, 11 more IRIS-T SLS systems, and additional IRIS-T SLM and IRIS-T SLS missiles, and 15 Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft guns with 249,680 rounds of ammunition. In the drone department, Germany has been equally generous. So far, the country has sent the following equipment: 212 vector reconnaissance drones with spare parts, 215 RQ-35 Hydron reconnaissance drones, 18 Promoco-1 reconnaissance drones, 7 Songbird reconnaissance drones, 70 frequency range extensions for anti-drone devices, 84 anti-drone sensors and jammers, 180 RF-360 drone detection systems, 93 drone sensors, 1 Lunar NG reconnaissance system, 10 anti-drone guns, 12 electronic anti-drone devices, and 20 unmanned surface vessels. Plus, in the coming months, Germany will send an additional 263 vector drones, 34 Hydron drones, 15 anti-drone sensors and jammers, and 50 unmanned surface vessels. Though each of these pieces of equipment is a lifesaver for Ukraine in its fight to protect its skies, none are arguably as important as the IRIS and Patriot air defense systems. The IRIS systems gifted by Germany have so far demonstrated a 100% kill rate in the Ukrainian war, managing to shoot down all targets, even when facing overwhelming odds. This system has also proven incredibly successful against the notorious Shahed 136 kamikaze drones. One look at the capabilities of the IRIS air defense systems, and these success rates will make perfect sense. The IRIS missile itself has a range of up to 25 miles and can hit targets flying at an altitude of up to 66,000 feet. The system's radar has a detection range of up to 155 miles, which allows it to track targets with high precision. But the best thing about this system is the agility of the IRIS missile. This, paired with an active radar proximity fuse and improved heat-seeking homing, allows the missile to take out fast-moving and small targets like those often seen in Russian attacks on Ukraine. As far as the Patriot air defense system goes, it offers a higher altitude defense against ballistic missiles, aircraft, and drones, sort of like the highest tier of the Israeli aerial defense array. As Ukraine lacks native air defenses, it heavily relies on the Patriot system to safeguard its airspace. According to Zelensky, Ukraine needs about 25 of these systems to successfully do so. However, so far Germany has been the only country that has sent multiple Patriot systems and batteries to Ukraine. Despite Zelensky's pleading with allies to follow in Germany's footsteps, none of the other NATO countries that possess these systems, Greece, the Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Spain, and Sweden, have committed to sending them. As for the US, the country sent 1 Patriot system in 2022. However, it plans to send more in 2024 as part of a massive aid package. But what makes Germany different from all other allies is, the country hasn't just been sending military aid to Ukraine, it's also been tirelessly pleading with other allies to do so. That's why this current push to use the NATO integrated air defense system to protect Ukraine seems so promising. As mentioned, Germany has been particularly proactive about Ukrainian air defense. In April 2024, the country launched a new initiative to secure more critically needed air defense systems for Ukraine. As Germany's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Annalena Baerbock, puts it, stronger air defenses are a matter of life and death for thousands of people in Ukraine and the best protection for our own security. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz continued these pleas by urging European allies to look at their stocks and provide whatever air defense systems they can to Ukraine. Of course, he highlighted the importance of the Patriot systems, which are the only systems that can counter all Russian attacks, whether via aircraft, missiles, or drones. Now, European countries are facing a choice: meet NATO's capability targets for their own states, or provide more aid to Ukraine. However, even NATO seems to be pushing for the second option, joining Germany's efforts. The alliance's Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, said that sacrificing individual countries' stockpile targets for the sake of aiding Ukraine is the only right choice. For now, it seems that the Netherlands, Czech Republic, and Denmark might be the first to rally behind the proposal. Polish officials have also previously discussed the possibility of aiding Ukraine more directly, but so far no concrete decisions have been made. Though if Germany succeeds in realizing its proposal, Poland will undoubtedly have a major role to play in defending Ukrainian airspace. But what do you think? Do you believe Germany will manage to find a way to protect Ukrainian airspace from drones? And if so, will Russia see this move as a clear message that Ukraine isn't alone, or just as an invitation to start an all-out war? And finally, which countries besides Germany will risk this all-out war to help Ukraine? Share your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Now go and check out how the German military will become Europe's most powerful, or click this other video instead. The prolonged conflict in Ukraine, now stretching well into its third year, has witnessed relentless Ukrainian resilience against formidable odds. While Russian forces have claimed minor territorial gains since the fall of Avdiivka in February, the reality is that these are costly and largely symbolic. Ukraine's strategic countermaneuvers and the staunch defense of key positions like northern Donetsk Oblast and the areas surrounding Bakhmut and Vuhledar in Zaporizhia Oblast underscore a narrative not just of survival, but of calculated resistance. This strategic endurance is all the more remarkable given Ukraine's current artillery challenges. Dubbed shell hunger, this shortfall has seen daily artillery discharges dwindle from 10,000 shells to roughly 2,000. This, coupled with damage to many Ukrainian howitzers due to precise Russian counter-battery efforts and new drone tactics, has undeniably strained Ukraine's defensive capabilities. Yet despite these setbacks, the spirit of Ukrainian forces remains unbroken. In contrast to the narrative of Russian advancement, the reality of the battlefield tells a different story. Russian forces, despite an extensive artillery arsenal and support from rogue states like North Korea, are achieving only marginal gains at an unsustainable cost. Their reliance on volume over tactical efficiency has not translated into decisive success, highlighting the inefficiencies and desperation underlying their military strategy. Amid these challenging dynamics, a beacon of support shines from Denmark. This Scandinavian ally has stepped up, ready to alter the course of events with significant artillery contributions. This move is not just a military aid package, it's a symbol of a shifting European foreign policy landscape that increasingly seeks to support Ukraine's staunch defense efforts. But how transformative could Denmark's involvement be, and what does this mean for the balance of power on the front lines? As Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov advocates for more Western artillery and ammunition, Denmark's commitment could very well be a game-changer. Providing the much-needed artillery might not only alleviate Ukraine's shell hunger, but could also empower Ukrainian forces to reclaim momentum. This support from Denmark and other Western nations underscores a collective international commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and resilience, setting the stage for a pivotal shift in the ongoing conflict. But how exactly is Denmark stepping up in this crucial hour? Before we explore their pivotal contributions, let's rewind to the events that set this commitment in motion. Just 2 days after the fall of Avdiivka, a bold announcement came from the north. Denmark pledged to donate all of its existing artillery units to Ukraine. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen broke sharply with Europe's cautious stance on arms support, criticizing the continent's hesitancy and highlighting the available resources. This is not only a question about production, because we have weapons, we have ammunition, we have air defenses that we don't have to use ourselves at the moment that we should deliver to Ukraine. With this declaration, Denmark not only promised critical military support, but also challenged other nations to reassess their positions. You see, to prove the point that such a donation would not be crippling to its arsenal, Denmark's Ministry of Defense said it was in the process of acquiring new military capabilities on a rapid basis to make up for the loss of units. In Munich, Frederiksen also stressed the importance of not waiting for a politically divided United States to take the lead on supplying the Ukrainians. It doesn't matter what the US comes up with. We Europeans have to defend ourselves. This is a war on the European continent. Frederiksen's remarks were the latest example of Denmark's evolving geopolitical strategy, and it's helpful to see Copenhagen's artillery donation in that light. Although Denmark was one of the founding members of the NATO alliance in 1949 and played a pivotal geostrategic role thanks to its control of the Baltic's western choke points, its overall level of security integration with the rest of Europe was not as well advanced. Until June 2022, Denmark was the only one of the European nation's 27 member states which did not participate in the latter's common security policy. Denmark did not take part in the EU defense discussions, nor get involved with the joint military missions. These opt-outs originated with Denmark's initial rejection of the Maastricht Treaty in a 1992 referendum. To secure Denmark's accession to the European Union, Copenhagen was granted a number of exceptions to the Maastricht Treaty through the Edinburgh Agreement. One of these involved defense issues. With these opt-outs in place, Danish voters agreed to join the EU on such terms in a second referendum the following year. This security opt-out policy was in tradition with Denmark's Cold War footing. Although it was a member of NATO, Denmark did not allow any foreign forces on its soil under the alliance's auspices. The Soviet Union was the dominant power in the Baltic and had troops in nearby Germany, troops which outnumbered the West's. Denmark wanted to place itself under America's nuclear umbrella, but did not otherwise want to risk upsetting the Soviet Union. Recent historical experience reminded Danish policymakers of the importance of this goal. British forces only barely prevented the Red Army from pushing on to Denmark when they captured the city of Lübeck in northern Germany on May 2, 1945, only hours before Soviet troops came into the area. The Soviet Union had also occupied the Danish island of Bornholm, which sits on strategic territory in the Baltic, since the previous year. Bornholm is an island roughly in the middle of the strait between Sweden's southern coast and Poland's northern one. A military presence there can cut off movement between east and west in the Baltic. Fortunately for the Danes on Bornholm, Stalin agreed to withdraw the Red Army from the island and did so in April 1946, thus making it a rare example of the Iron Curtain receding in the immediate post-World War II era. However, Stalin's move only came with the understanding that Denmark would not host foreign troops on its soil, even though it was in the West's sphere of influence. American and British policymakers quietly agreed about this, and the unspoken agreement held throughout the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, Denmark slackened on its defense spending. It last spent 2% of its GDP on defense in 1989 and fell to a low of 1.1% in 2015. But that's now starting to change too, as it further integrated itself with European and NATO security networks and gradually ended the policy of quasi-neutrality. Denmark also pledged that it would increase its defense spending and hit the 2% mark by 2033, although there will undoubtedly be many voices in the West that say this rate of increase is too slow. Either way, recent moves in Denmark suggest that its long period of relative military neutrality is coming to an end, and this policy shift has been sanctioned by Danish voters. On June 1, 2022, Denmark held a referendum that asked a simple question. Do you vote yes or no on Denmark being able to participate in the European defense and security cooperation by abolishing the EU defense opt-out? Amidst Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Danish voters chose yes by a margin of nearly 67 to 32%. The vote therefore ended Copenhagen's comparative military isolation from the rest of Europe. The result meant that Danish troops could participate in joint military operations under the EU's banner and have more of an influence in joint European defense policy. More importantly, the result of the referendum made it far easier for the Danish military to acquire weapons and equipment, which is one of the reasons why Copenhagen understands that it can donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Russia reacted negatively to the news and stopped supplying natural gas to one of Denmark's power companies. Although this did not significantly affect Denmark's energy supply, the move was another demonstration of Russia's willingness to use coercive methods as a means of statecraft. These maneuvers on the part of Moscow likely only further convinced Danish voters that they had made the right decision. Even before the invasion, Denmark was signaling the beginning of its seismic shift in security policy. As Russia was gathering its forces along the Ukrainian border and an invasion seemed imminent, PM Frederiksen suggested that negotiations were ongoing with the United States on a new bilateral defense agreement that could station American troops and military equipment on Danish soil for the first time. Danish Defense Minister Morten Bødskov said any new agreement would be designed to give American forces better access to Europe. The agreement would also likely allow for more cross-training between American and Danish troops, and perhaps more importantly, could make acquiring new military equipment and ammunition easier for the Danes. Once it joined the broader European defense community, Denmark demonstrated its disproportionate willingness to supply Ukraine. It's one of the major donors of F-16 fighter jets, supplying the Ukrainians with 19 of them, which should be sent out by 2025. This is the broader context behind Denmark's more recent decision to donate all of its artillery to Ukraine. Copenhagen's donation of artillery amounts to a small sum, as it has no MLRS units or towed artillery. Rather, the GFI lists Denmark as having 19 self-propelled artillery units, with 15 of them being in a state of readiness. These units are the French-made CEASEFIRE self-propelled howitzer. The CEASEFIRE entered service in 2008 and has an operational range of about 600 kilometers, with a crew between 3 and 5 operators. Each unit has a typical magazine of 36 shells. The CEASEFIRE fires NATO standard 155mm ammunition, up to a range of 34 kilometers and up to 42 kilometers when using an extended range full-bore shell (ERFB). These rounds were originally designed by the Canadian artillery engineer Gerard Bull, who became famous for working on the concept of Saddam Hussein's Project Babylon superguns, Big Babylon and Baby Babylon. Bull was assassinated in 1990, possibly by Israeli agents who did not want to see the Iraqis' superguns become a reality. Unlike standard rounds, these shells are longer and thinner. ERFB rounds have peculiar nubs around their midsections, which help to engage the rifling in the gun and stabilize the projectile in flight, although later ERFB rounds may not have these. ERFB rounds have significantly increased range compared to a standard shell, but at the cost of reduced accuracy. The decreased accuracy has meant that the ERFB round has not become a NATO standard, but the CESA is nevertheless capable of firing it. The CESA can increase its range even further, up to a range of 52 kilometers, when it uses rocket-assisted shells. Each CESA costs about $7.5 million per unit, but the pricing depends on individual contracts. As an example, the acquisition of 52 CESA howitzers was approved by the Czech Ministry of Defense on September 1, 2021, and the value of that contract is around $288 million. The CESA has to this point performed well in the war. Correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but it may be more than coincidental that after Ukraine started to receive its CESA guns, Russian artillery units began to suffer heavy losses. Its introduction, therefore, seems to have coincided with better Ukrainian counter-battery fire. At the height of the Ukrainian gunners' effectiveness, the Russians were supposedly losing between 20 and 40 artillery systems per day. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the CESA was not enough to turn the tide, as the Russians dug in with the benefit of the most elaborate network of fortifications seen in Europe since the First World War. Ukraine's Zaporizhia campaign failed to reach even its first objective, the road junction at Tokmak. As of April 2024, the Oryx blog lists a visually confirmed 8 losses of CESA units. 5 have been destroyed and 3 damaged. Denmark's donation of its 19 CESAs comes amid new French donations of the unit. Sensing the desperate shortage of artillery for the Ukrainians, France announced in January that it intended to deliver an additional 78 CESA units to Ukraine and sought €280 million to assist with 60 of these. While Denmark was already sending all of its CESA artillery units to Ukraine by April 2023, Fredriksson's remarks in Munich were an announcement that it would be sending a different system there too. In addition to the CESA units, Denmark has 21 X-21 Cardon mortars, which will now be on their way to Ukraine. The Cardon was originally created in Israel and can be chambered to fire 81 or 120mm shells. The 120mm Cordon is muzzle-loaded, but despite this, the mortar has a burst rate of 16 rounds per minute and a sustained rate of fire of around 4 rounds per minute. The Cardon operates on an autonomous recoil system and is controlled by computers, although it can be laid and targeted manually with its backup handles and optical sights if the computerized fire control is compromised. The Cardon has an effective range of about 7.2 kilometers. To improve accuracy, the Danes decided to equip their Cardon mortars with MVRS 700SC muzzle velocity radar systems manufactured by their domestic Weibel company. This system takes account of atmospheric conditions like temperature and humidity, which influence the conditions in the barrel and therefore the muzzle velocity of the mortar's round, which in turn influences the accuracy of its fire. The MVRS 700SC's presence allows the Danish Cardon systems to compensate for environmental conditions and improve their accuracy. This radar system is integrated with the Cardon's computerized fire control system through an antenna and a processor. The Danes received the Cardon in 2019 and specifically sought to use it as mobile firepower. Following Russia's original intervention in Ukraine in 2014, one of the lessons Denmark took away was the vulnerability of artillery to counter battery fire thanks to radar and drone detection. To adapt to this reality, the Danes decided to integrate the Israeli Cardon mortar with their new Piranha 5 armored personnel carrier. The integration better allows the Cardon to deliver fire support and then move away before the enemy can spot it and retaliate. Denmark's decision to send its entire artillery force to Ukraine is the latest sign of a gradually changing philosophy among the Western powers. As the war commenced, Western nations were cautious about escalating the conflict, hesitating to supply Ukraine with high-impact weaponry such as long-range ballistic and cruise missiles. This cautious stance began to shift dramatically in 2023, marked by significant support, including main battle tanks, cluster bombs, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and the pivotal American ATACMS for Ukraine's HIMARS units. Despite these substantial commitments, which initially raised concerns about escalation, the successful utilization of these systems by Ukraine in 2022 helped to alleviate fears, shifting the focus toward the potential depletion of Western arsenals. Years of peace, along with a focus on counterterrorism, had not prepared the West for the intense demands of modern, high-intensity warfare, where sophisticated ammunition is consumed at an alarming rate. This concern is compounded by the complexity and vulnerability of the supply chains needed to produce and distribute modern precision munitions. Yet the Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen argued that supporting Ukraine, even at the expense of Western stockpiles, was a strategic necessity. In her view, a Russian defeat in Ukraine would ultimately enhance Western security more reliably than maintaining large arsenals at home. While Denmark's contribution of artillery might not decisively tip the scales of the war, Frederiksen hoped her bold move would catalyze broader European support, encouraging a more substantial collective effort. This hope seemed to be materializing when, at a Munich conference, Czech defense official Jan Jiras revealed that 800,000 artillery shells could be procured from non-Western stockpiles for Ukraine at a cost of $1.5 billion, proposing a feasible solution to swiftly bolster Ukraine's artillery capabilities. His announcement underscored a growing willingness among European nations to find innovative ways to support Ukraine's defense and maintain the momentum in its counteroffensive efforts. On March 8th, Czech President Petr Pavel announced that a group of 18 countries had funded the purchase of all of those shells in full. Germany alone would buy 180,000 rounds with a price tag of $618 million, which amounted to 40% of the total. Denmark also participated in the financing alongside Belgium, the Netherlands, and Canada. The effort that Denmark contributed to resulted in the procurement of about 400,000 of the shells. At about the same time, the Czechs identified a further 700,000 idle artillery shells that could be purchased for $1.8 billion. Ukraine's Western allies, including Denmark, have agreed to purchase these also. Thanks to Europe's collective efforts, Ukraine's artillery and shell shortage looks like it will end by this summer. When the Czech-brokered ammunition begins to arrive, the expected date of delivery is June. As the summer matures, Ukraine might begin to fire around 6,000 shells per day, 3 times as many as now. The number might grow further to 10,000 per day, now that the divided United States Congress has decided to deliver additional aid. Ukraine's shell hunger is about to end. And the way in which it will come to an end is an item of evidence in favor of PM Frederiksen's notion of the need for Europe to take the lead in its own defense. For her, defeating Russia in Ukraine now, even if it means a depletion of valuable military stockpiles at home, is a preferable option to using those weapons in a future on one's own doorstep in another, worse conflict down the line. But will the rest of Europe follow suit? Do you agree with PM Frederiksen? Should Western countries send much more of their available arsenals to Ukraine? Is this the best way for Europe to secure itself from future Russian aggression? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons to help the channel and for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out why Russia can't stop US weapons, or click this other video instead. In January 2024, NATO kicked off Steadfast Defender 2024. An exercise so massive it's been dubbed the biggest military shuffle since the legendary Cold War reforger maneuvers of 1988. This isn't just any routine drill, it's a historical behemoth marking NATO's grandest display in the post-Cold War era. With new members on board and tensions in Europe simmering, this exercise has all the ingredients of a high-stakes military drama. For the first time, Sweden flexed its muscles alongside NATO powers as a fully fledged member, expanding the scope and intensity of the alliance's maneuvers. But as you might guess, not everyone's throwing a party over this. Putin has been eyeing these developments with more than a little unease. In today's video, we're diving deep into Steadfast Defender 2024. We'll break down the nuts and bolts of the exercises, explore Russia's chilly reception, and unpack the strategic moves that have led NATO to ramp up its game. Buckle up, it's going to be an intriguing ride through modern military history. Let's get started with a quick overview. Steadfast Defender began on January 22nd and will end on May 31st. It involves all 32 NATO countries, including Sweden, which formally joined the alliance as the operation was underway. 90,000 troops will take part in this drill, which will span the entirety of NATO's territory from North America to the Russian border. General Christopher Cavoli, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, stated that Steadfast Defender would be a demonstration of the alliance's ability to reinforce the entire Euro-Atlantic area, including through transatlantic movements of forces to counter the threat of a near-peer adversary. In other words, this exercise would simulate a combined response to a Russian attack on a NATO country, almost certainly in Eastern Europe. Poland, the Baltic, Germany, Norway, and Romania are therefore major areas for the exercise's operations, as all of these places are considered vulnerable to a Russian attack. In outlining the overall goal of the operation, Cavoli stated, "Exercise Steadfast Defender 2024 will be a clear demonstration of our unity, our strength, and our determination to protect each other, to protect our values and the rules-based international order." American units participating in the Steadfast Defender exercise include the U.S. Second Fleet, Green Berets, and Marines. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, over 50 total naval assets are taking part in Steadfast Defender, along with more than 1,100 combat vehicles. These vehicles include over 150 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, and 400 armored personnel carriers. Aircraft included are F-35s, FA-18s, F-15s, and Harrier jets and helicopters. 20,000 troops from the United Kingdom are also among the participants. 16,000 of these are from the British Army, with much of the activity coming from the 7th Light Mechanized Brigade Combat Team, which has taken its tanks, artillery, and helicopters with it. Other British Army units in Steadfast Defender 2024 include the Commando Helicopter Force, 16th Air Assault Brigade, and 16th Armored Brigade Combat Team. 2,000 sailors and 400 Royal Marines from the Royal Navy are participating as well. A British carrier strike group centered on one of the two Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers and its assortment of F-35B fighters is taking part in exercises in the North Atlantic, North Sea, and the Baltic. 15,000 of the troops in Steadfast Defender are from Poland, 10,000 are from Germany, an additional 5,000 are Dutch. The Steadfast Defender exercises are meant to be the first large-scale test of NATO's new defense plans that were approved at the Alliance's summit in Vilnius this year. According to NATO, Steadfast Defender 2024 is based on a fictitious Article 5 scenario triggered by a fictitious attack against the Alliance launched by a near-peer adversary. The Alliance's official website has detailed a timeline that offers an overview of all the sub-exercises in Steadfast Defender and their purposes. According to NATO, the first part of Steadfast Defender is focused on securing the Atlantic up to the Arctic. Live maritime exercises and amphibious assault drills are a big focus for this phase. The second part of Steadfast Defender is focused on moving troops through Europe. Troops and equipment will be deployed rapidly across national borders as part of this phase. The exercise began on January 22nd in Norfolk, Virginia. That city hosts NATO's Joint Command Force Norfolk, which is coordinating the first phase. American forces would be departing from there on that date, while Canadian forces would set off from Nova Scotia soon afterward. Between February 11th and 20th, NATO conducted maritime live exercises to test its ability to secure lines of reinforcement and communication across the Atlantic. According to the Alliance, these drills, called MARCOM LIVEX, were conducted primarily off the Spanish coast. The next set of exercises, called Brilliant Jump, took place between February 12th and 28th. These tested the NATO response force's ability to plan and execute rapid deployments, including standby readiness during peacetime. These exercises were based in Germany and Poland. Then came Joint Warrior, led by the United Kingdom, where it primarily took place between February 24th and March 3rd. These drills emphasized maritime and offshore maneuvers in conjunction with air and land operations. Exercise Dragon 24 came between February 25th and March 14th. This one was led by Poland as part of a unilateral effort to train all branches of its armed forces to respond to crises. About 20,000 total troops from 10 NATO countries participated in Dragon 24. All of the 15,000 Polish troops in Steadfast Defender took part in the exercise. Sabre Strike 24 just started in April 2024 and is being led by US Army Europe and Africa. This set of exercises is also part of Part 2 and takes place from April 8th to 30th in Germany, Poland, and Lithuania, and it's putting emphasis on rapid deployment and cold weather training in the Baltic area. From February 29th to March 14th, NATO troops participated in Trojan Footprint 24, a drill that focused on improving the integration and interoperability of member states' respective special operations forces. Bulgaria, Georgia, Germany, Greece, North Macedonia, and Romania were the main host countries for this drill. About 2,000 special operations troops from Albania, Bulgaria, France, Georgia, Greece, Italy, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Portugal, Romania, Spain, the United Kingdom, and the United States participated in the exercise. The United States contributed about 900 of those troops. The Green Berets were known to participate in airborne operations alongside Greek paratroopers as part of the exercise. The Trojan Footprint exercise has occurred annually since 2002. The Crystal Arrow set of exercises took place between March 4th and 15th. Latvia was the host country for these drills, and the Latvian Mechanized Infantry Brigade led them. The purpose was to practice alert procedures and evaluate the readiness of NATO's multinational battle group Latvia. The Nordic response drills occurred between March 3rd and 14th. As the name implies, the purpose of this drill was to increase NATO's ability to address challenges in the extreme north. Finland and Sweden's entry into the alliance expanded these exercises. This drill involved over 20,000 troops, 50 ships, and 110 aircraft from 14 NATO countries. The next on NATO's list is Defender 24, scheduled for the span of April 8th to May 31st, and organized by the United States European Command. This exercise involves deployment of forces over distances stretching from North America to US EUCOM's area of responsibility, with Northern Europe as the primary focus point. Defender 24 tests NATO's ability to receive, stage, and deploy these forces in Europe. Defender 24 is the foundation for other exercises like Sabre Strike 24, Immediate Response 24, and Swift Response 24. Immediate response will occur between April 21st and May 31st. The United States will lead this exercise that's designed to boost the interoperability of NATO countries. The Hungarians will lead the Brave Warrior exercises between May 1st and 22nd and will include all forces in NATO's multinational battle group Hungary. Its purpose is to increase the training for this battle group to lead international operations and plan and conduct defensive operations. Spring Storm will take place in Estonia between May 12th and 31st. It's that country's largest annual military drill and will be led by one of the Estonian Defense Forces infantry divisions. It will focus on joint defensive operations with other NATO units. The aforementioned Swift Response 24 will occur between May 14th and June 14th, therefore going over the time technically allotted to the broader Steadfast Defender exercise. The United States will lead this drill and focus on joint airborne operations. Poland, the Baltic states, and Georgia will be the primary staging grounds. Finally, there is the German-led Grand Quadriga exercise, set to take place between April 30th and July 30th, running well over the allotted time for Steadfast Defender. Germany and Lithuania will be the primary staging grounds. The Grand Quadriga drills will focus on deterrence and NATO's defense posture. Taken together, we see that the Steadfast Defender 2024 exercise will simulate multiple types of combat across the entirety of NATO's territory, implying that it will test the alliance's ability to fight a war across a broad front resembling the World Wars. Though NATO made carefully worded statements to stress that Steadfast Defender was not directed against any country, Russia is the only one that fits the bill of being able to create the scenario the alliance was training to counter. A NATO official, quoted by the US Department of Defense, admitted that the alliance was closely watching the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and incorporating its lessons into plans to improve training, capabilities, and innovation. Policymakers in Moscow were not fooled either. Before the exercises began, Russia's foreign ministry claimed that NATO was conducting a demonstration of force on Russia's doorstep. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Alexander Grushko, called Steadfast Defender the irrevocable return of the alliance to Cold War hostility. Another spokesman for the Russian government, Dmitry Peskov, said that the exercises were quite unprecedented and that NATO was making no attempt to hide the fact that they were aimed against Russia. On February 5th, former Russian President and Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev warned on social media that there was a potential for a big war with NATO, and said that Steadfast Defender 2024 came as a result of Western politicians who have shit their pants. Their mediocre NATO generals have once again decided to scare us. Medvedev insisted that Russia would never strike first against a NATO country, but that it would be prepared to respond to an attack against its own integrity or increased NATO association with Ukraine. Not coincidentally, Vladimir Putin himself traveled to Kaliningrad shortly after Steadfast Defender began. According to the Institute for the Study of War, the Russians have done more than complain about Steadfast Defender. They have tried to undermine it. On January 20th, before the exercises began, the ISW accused Russia of conducting an information operation to misrepresent the NATO exercise. According to the ISW, the Kremlin's information operation against Steadfast Defender came in several dimensions. Firstly, it tried to portray the drills as a provocation on the part of NATO. This cannot be the truth because the exercise is based on a simulated Article 5 scenario. Article 5 in the North Atlantic Treaty is by law defensive in nature. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that, if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. The North Atlantic Treaty, therefore, establishes that NATO is a defensive alliance. It does not cover the scenarios of a member provoking or aggressing against another country. Article 5 cannot be invoked for such purposes. The Steadfast Defender exercise also came in direct response against Russia's increasing provocations, not only against Ukraine, but against former members of the alliance. A case in point can be found in leaked Kremlin documents that were composed in the fall of 2021 by Russia's Directorate for Interregional Relations and Cultural Contacts. These documents were leaked to Swedish media in May 2023. They revealed that Russia would attempt to increase its influence over the Baltic states and reduce NATO's presence there between 2022 and 2030. In the short term, Russia sought to create new centers of influence, like NGOs, to promote closer cooperation between the Baltic states and itself, and preserve historical memory by stopping the demolition of Soviet-era monuments. NATO and its relations with the Baltic states is a key area of focus for the Kremlin. Stopping NATO's plans to build a permanent base in Lithuania by 2030, the militarization of Lithuanian territory, as the relevant document called it, is one of the plan's primary concerns. By 2030, Russia also aims to get the Baltic states to reverse course in their opinion on NATO. Through opinion-shaping operations, the Kremlin aims for the Baltic states to come to view NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe as potentially damaging to their national security. As such, Russia wants to stop their increasing cooperation with NATO's forward presence in Eastern Europe and gradually restore ties with these former Soviet states, including military ties. Russia plans to foster pro-Moscow politicians in the Baltic states and take advantage of the presence of the sizable ethnic Russian minorities in Estonia and Latvia. Although the documents outline plans for Russia to use soft power methods like the promotion of cultural ties and increase of cross-border investments, Moscow plans to use harder methods too. One of these is to stop the Baltic states from leaving the treaty that synchronizes their electric grids into a shared network with Russia and Belarus. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are in the process of integrating their power grids with Europe. The Baltic states plan to complete this process after a test at the end of 2025, and from that point forward, abandon the shared grid with Russia and Belarus. The Russian documents identified this plan as a threat. These documents are similar to the ones Russia drafted concerning Belarus, which some believe is an annexation plan. It is likely that the officials who wrote these documents did not know that Putin had plans to invade Ukraine, as there were no such hints, and many of their theories seem much more outlandish now than even in 2021. Nevertheless, the documents outlined Russia's general attitude of disrespect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states that had once been within the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire. Tellingly, Russia explicitly mentioned the Baltic states when responding to the NATO drills. According to the Kremlin, the alliance was using the Steadfast Defender exercise to wind up and provoke the Baltic states into a war with Russia. This is the attitude that NATO's Steadfast Defender exercises were designed in response to. It's not a coincidence that these exercises came after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the revelation of these sorts of plans. Russia's rhetorical attempt to shift the narrative to NATO being the aggressor is not only a bid to escape scrutiny for its aggressive actions, it can also be seen as a way to shape the information environment for future moves against the Baltic states, as Moscow may claim that it's responding to a potential attack. In general, Putin has identified and viewed the Western powers as his and Russia's enemy, and his response to Steadfast Defender was not the first time he has attempted to create this information environment. He has repeatedly claimed that he is fighting in Ukraine because of Western aggression and threats against Russia. According to the ISW, recent Russian electronic warfare exercises in Kaliningrad may have also been more of a grey zone operation than a strict exercise. These exercises took place between December 25th and 27th, 2023, and again between January 10th and 16th, 2024. The Russian exercises reportedly caused unprecedentedly high GPS jamming in northern and central Poland, as well as in the southern Baltic area. It's in this context that NATO decided to conduct the largest exercise since the Cold War. While Steadfast Defender has gone smoothly so far, the exercise comes at a time of peril for the alliance. Russia is gaining momentum in Ukraine, albeit at a high price. The Russian military has suffered enormously, but has adapted to developments on the battlefield, including with the use of drones. NATO countries have also shown vulnerability. On the day before Steadfast Defender began, the alliance reported that it would miss its overall target for spending 2% of GDP on defense, as most of the members would not hit that mark. While NATO members have increased their defense spending since 2014 and pledged to greatly increase military expenditures following the invasion of Ukraine, only 11 of the 32 members of the alliance spent at least 2% in 2023. More are expected to reach the goal this year, including Montenegro, North Macedonia, Denmark, and the newest NATO member, Sweden. However, Western European countries continue to fall short of the target, testing America's patience in the process. During a bitterly partisan presidential election, experts warn that Western Europe is running out of time to get its act together. While President Biden has been more patient, he is deeply unpopular at home, and both of his immediate predecessors were far more critical of NATO countries being free riders. There is no guarantee that his successor, whoever it is, will be as patient as he is. Furthermore, Russia has been more resilient in the face of sanctions than many in the West had hoped for. Russia's economy survived the temporary shock and has transitioned to a war footing. Russia has kept pace with productions of tanks, vehicles, missiles, and other pieces of military hardware. Meanwhile, many NATO allies have low stockpiles of ammunition, which have been further stressed in supplying Ukraine. This reality has caused officials from Germany, Belgium, and Sweden to warn that NATO allies have a short window to prepare for a potential war with Russia. Admiral Rob Bauer of the Netherlands, the chairman of NATO's military committee, warned that the West has grown too accustomed to peace and needs to be more prepared for conflict, which will involve the whole of society, whether we like it or not. This reveals the purpose of Steadfast Defender 2024. NATO allies are working together in a series of maneuvers of unprecedented size to prepare for a potential war, and Russia's conduct toward NATO's members and the alliance as a whole has only reinforced the need for preparedness. The results of Steadfast Defender will undoubtedly be discussed and analyzed at the 2024 NATO summit to be held in Washington between July 9th and 11th. These results will likely be the foundation for future exercises and a general transition of the alliance toward a state of further readiness for conflict. Overall, Steadfast Defender is a sign of the times. NATO officials have warned that Western countries had become complacent in the belief that history had ended in 1991. That was not the case, and now the alliance must relearn the skills and acquire a state of readiness that had been allowed to atrophy. Do you think Steadfast Defender exercises will assist NATO in its preparedness? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
At the height of the Cold War, the countries involved were spending exorbitant amounts of money on defense. For West Germany, this figure was roughly 3% of its gross domestic product, or GDP. The UK more than doubled this figure with 6.3%. However, this was nowhere near the US's spending, which averaged about 8.6% of the country's GDP. Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, was a clear frontrunner with its military expenditure reaching a staggering 15% of its GDP by some estimates. Then, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Cold War drew to a close. This ushered in the era of the so-called peace dividend, when countries were finally able to reduce their military spending. The iron grip of fear loosened, and a new dawn of opportunity and growth emerged. But fast forward to the 2020s, and it seems that it's getting dark once again. As the post-Cold War peace dividend hangs by a thread, countries are ramping up their defense budgets once again, while their government officials are warning the citizens to brace for war. An all-out war in Europe. On one side, Russia, and the other, NATO. Ever since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, these two opposing parties have been engaged in a high-stakes geopolitical chess game, with those stakes growing higher by the day. The situation seemingly reached an all-time high 2 years later when French President Emmanuel Macron opened the door to European nations sending troops to Ukraine in February 2024, reaffirming this possibility some 3 months later. If you're unsure as to why this is such a big deal, all you need to know is that Ukraine isn't a NATO member state, so the alliance is only allowed to send aid and not any combat troops. With Russia's President Vladimir Putin responding to Macron's bold statement and the possibility of a NATO-Russia conflict with an ambiguous "everything is possible in the modern world," all that is left to do is to ask a simple question: when will an all-out war between Russia and NATO break out? We don't have to go far to get an answer to this question. What's more, we don't even have to speculate or estimate. Top NATO military officials have come out and stated exactly when this war is expected to happen: by 2044. That makes for potentially 20 years of tensions, brinkmanship, and the ever-present threat of conflict. But to make matters worse, the prediction was made in January 2024 at a meeting of NATO's Military Committee in Brussels. That was before Macron's statement further chipped away at an already fragile relationship between Russia and NATO. Now this clash seems much more imminent, with Russia warning that it would be nothing but a stepping stone to World War III. This frightening possibility has forced all NATO member countries to reconsider their assessments and plans for the future. Just a few months back, in December 2023, German Minister of Defense Boris Pistorius warned that his country only had 5 to 8 years to prepare for the next major conflict. Though judging how things are currently unfolding, this could turn into as little as 5 to 8 months. But how did we get here? Is Macron's statement the only reason why a NATO-Russia clash seems both inevitable and imminent? Absolutely not. Far from it, actually. Let's discuss all the chess piece moves that have brought us to this checkmate position where the slightest misstep could lead to catastrophic consequences. Move number 1. After fighting fiercely for nearly 2 years, Ukraine seems to be on the brink of defeat. And Ukraine's loss can only mean one thing: a domino effect of chaos and conflict. NATO will lose face and Putin will feel more emboldened than ever. With this new dynamic, the whole of Europe will be at Russia's mercy. But let us pose the same question once again. How did we get here? Wasn't Ukraine giving a masterclass in defending your country against a much more powerful enemy with seemingly endless resources? Well, that's just it. There's only so much you can do with asymmetrical warfare and sheer determination. Beyond that, you need those resources, especially when the invading side keeps pouring more and more into the conflict with every passing day. So where are these much-needed resources for Ukraine? Buried under red tape and stuck in a political game of finger-pointing and bickering. That's where. The first part mostly refers to the US, which has been the #1 aid donor to Ukraine since the invasion started. However, the last aid package from the country was delayed for roughly 6 months due to a strong Republican opposition. For Ukraine, these 6 months felt like 6 years. The city of Avdiivka fell under Russian control, taking an estimated 7,000 Ukrainian lives with it. This loss reverberated far beyond the city's borders, signaling that Russia might be turning the tide in the conflict. Luckily, the $61 billion aid package was finally approved in April 2024. The very existence of the Ukrainian nation hinged on a vote taking place in the U.S. House of Representatives, some 5,000 miles away. This new package is likely to include air defense systems, mid- and long-range missiles, and artillery shells, all things Ukraine has been desperately pleading for in the last few months. This should be enough to help the country challenge Russia's air superiority and slow its troops, who've recently captured hundreds of square miles of Ukraine's territory. The overwhelming sentiment in Ukraine is better late than never. However, some experts can't help but wonder, has the aid arrived too late? But wait a second, the US might be the biggest donor, but it certainly isn't the only one. What about the European states that have also supported Ukraine bravely and consistently? What about Germany, France, the UK? Well, remember the finger-pointing and bickering we just mentioned a few minutes back? These countries are the main actors in those silly yet tense discussions. So, what's the issue? The issue lies in the amount of aid promised and delivered by each of these NATO countries. The consensus seems to be that France isn't doing enough. These accusations started being thrown around after the German think tank, the Kiel Institute, published the Ukraine Support Tracker, totaling all the military, financial, and humanitarian aid sent to Ukraine. According to the Kiel Institute, in a little more than 2 years, the US alone donated $72 billion worth of aid to Ukraine. The European countries together donated almost $100 billion, but the trouble lies in the breakdown of those European countries. Germany tops the list with $11 billion in military aid, $3 billion in humanitarian aid, and $1.5 billion in financial aid. Next, we have the UK, which sent $5.7 billion in military aid, $600 million in humanitarian aid, and $3.5 billion in financial aid. Then, we go one place down the list, and another, and one more, and then 2 more, and yup, there's France. So far, France has helped Ukraine with almost $3 billion in military aid, $400 million in humanitarian aid, and $870 million in financial aid. Given that France has the third largest economy in Europe and the first two economies are Germany and the UK, France's contribution to Ukraine was seen as modest at best. But the biggest issue wasn't the amount of aid itself, it was the all-grand promises and awe-inspiring declarations made by the French president, only for them to be followed up with almost no action. That's why the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz ordered European officials to compose lists of the planned weapons shipments to Ukraine in January 2024. This move was seen as an attempt to put pressure on countries that have been underperforming in the aid department. Scholz criticized these contributions for being too small and urged the European allies to step up their efforts in support for Ukraine. The Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Radosław Sikorski, went a step further some 10 days later, implying that some countries chose not to get involved in the war in Ukraine out of fear and indifference. As he put it, these countries are willing to sacrifice other people's land or freedom for their own peace of mind. Though Italy and Spain, two of Europe's top economies, have also been criticized for their inactivity, France seems to have borne the brunt of the criticism due to the discrepancy between promises and actions. France, for its part, fired back at accusations, claiming that the Kiel Institute's estimates are neither trustworthy nor viable. Later, the French Minister of the Armed Forces, Sébastien Lecornu, attacked Germany, claiming that the country was reluctant to send the life-changing long-range Taurus KEPD-350 missiles. France, on the other hand, had promised to send 40 or so of these crucial missiles to help Ukraine bolster its defenses against Russia. Germany was also criticized for attempting to go solo and unilaterally pledging over $7 billion in aid for Ukraine. So the situation is clear. Europe's largest economies are in an escalating conflict, and Ukraine will be the only one to pay the price. Why? Well, while the NATO giants are engaging in political bickering and withholding aid, Russia seems to be flourishing. The country's military budget for 2024 has reached a staggering record high of $140 billion. This figure means that Russia will be using roughly one-third of all government spending on defense, which sends a clear message: Russia's in it for the long haul. Putin seems to have prepared Russia's economy and the entire country for a lengthy war, raising concerns about a more widespread conflict in Europe. Russia's plans to recruit 300,000 more personnel in 2024 do nothing to quell these fears. If Russia continues to almost miraculously recuperate its lost troops and equipment, Ukraine might not stand a chance of winning the war. And if Ukraine fails, a Russian-NATO conflict is almost a given. Why? We've already mentioned it. There's simply no way Putin will stop at only Ukraine. Military experts believe he's already set his sights on the next targets, the Baltic states. If the war in Ukraine doesn't directly cause a NATO-Russia conflict, what happens after the war almost certainly will. Well, if Russia wins, of course. So what is Putin's plan? It's simple, really. Conquer the former Soviet states that are now NATO members. Move number 2 on our chessboard. The Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, are the first on his list for 3 reasons. Number 1, they have quite sizable Russian-speaking populations, which allows Putin to justify any intervention as protecting Russian citizens abroad, a strategy he used in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Number 2, the fall of Ukraine leaves access to those countries wide open, which in turn means that all of Eastern Europe is within Russia's reach. And number 3, these 3 countries have limited military capabilities on their own, making them relatively easy targets for a freshly energized Russia. Plus, let's be honest, there was simply no way Putin would tolerate being fully surrounded by NATO member countries in Europe. And that's precisely what happened when Finland and Sweden joined NATO after decades of unwavering neutrality. Though Russia's reaction mostly consisted of words, not actions, this move undoubtedly pushed the country closer to an armed conflict with NATO in the future. Move number 3 on our chessboard, if you will. This just leaves us with one more move to go, the first not directly involving Russia or Ukraine, or any European country for that matter. The move in question directly depends on the outcome of the 2024 US presidential election. You see, former President Donald Trump, who's seeking re-election in 2024, has been calling out NATO for years. His primary criticism is that the US pays the lion's share of NATO's budget, while other member countries can't even keep up with their contribution target of 2% of their GDP. He even went as far as to say that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to the countries not paying their dues. From this sentence alone, it's easy to understand why Trump's re-election might lead to an all-out war a lot sooner than we anticipated. If he reduces the US's contribution to NATO or pulls the country out altogether and turns a blind eye to the troubles of other member states, there won't be any stopping Putin. As this life-or-death clock ticks away, potentially counting down the days to a NATO-Russia conflict, an important question emerges. How will this conflict start? Again, we don't have to speculate much. We have a leaked German war game document to paint a vivid picture. Now, to be fair, NATO has publicly distanced itself from this war plan, describing it as an imaginary situation to test military capabilities in a particular area. However, this confidential document composed by the German Ministry of Defense seems pretty realistic given the current situation in Europe. Plus, it provides an updated timeline of the all-out war in Europe, placing it practically behind the corner. With this in mind, let's see when Germany expects an all-out war with Russia and how this war will begin. According to the German Ministry of Defense, the first in the chain of events that'll lead to a war will be Russia's mass mobilization of new military forces that would allow the country to substantially weaken the Ukrainian positions on the battlefield in the coming months. The next stage of the brewing war includes what Russia does best: hybrid warfare. This could entail any of the gray zone strategies Russia is so fond of: recruiting asylum seekers and sending them as spies to enemy countries, pushing tens of thousands of migrants toward an enemy country's border to cause a crisis and overwhelm the country's resources, covertly funding and supporting political movements or parties that align with Russian interests to sow discord and weaken the enemy from within, launching cyber attacks on critical infrastructure such as power grids, transportation systems, and communication networks, using information warfare to spread propaganda, fake news, and disinformation to manipulate public opinion and undermine trust in democratic institutions. You name it, Russia has done it. In Europe, Moscow would likely aim most of these hybrid warfare strategies at the Baltic states, trying to incite the Russian-speaking minorities to create unrest and provide a pretext for intervention. But Russia wouldn't intervene immediately. No, it would first use the crisis in the Baltics to justify a massive military exercise similar to Zapad 2021. This joint strategic exercise between Russian and Belarusian armed forces lasted for 5 days and involved approximately 200,000 military personnel, up to 760 pieces of military equipment, and 15 ships. According to some experts, this exercise was nothing but preparation for the invasion of Ukraine. In that same vein, the possible Zapad 2024 military exercise would set the stage for an attack on Baltic states, and thus NATO. Only this time Russia wouldn't exactly be able to gather so many troops and equipment for the exercise, given how much Russian military resources have been decimated in Ukraine. However, Germany believes that at least 50,000 Russian troops would make their way to Belarus and Western Russia. But still, Russia wouldn't attack. Instead, it would start spreading propaganda that NATO is about to do so. This would be relatively easy for this efficient propaganda machine, as the NATO members would deservingly raise alarms about Russia's actions. While overtly warning about NATO, Russia would covertly move more troops and weapons to Belarus and its Kaliningrad enclave, which just so happens to be situated between Lithuania and Poland. Both NATO members and potential targets for Russia. But these two countries share another thing: an ill-defined 60-mile strip of land called the Suwalki Gap, also referred to as the most dangerous place on Earth and NATO's weak spot in Eastern Europe. But what's the deal with this tiny piece of land? Well, believe it or not, it has huge implications for power dynamics in Europe. Basically, whoever's in control of the Suwalki Gap holds a key strategic position among NATO members. And as you might have guessed, Russia wants this position and the influence over NATO's eastern flank it provides. That's why seizing the Suwalki Gap would be next on Russia's list of priorities. But again, Russia would take its time. According to the German war plan, no direct actions would be taken before the US presidential election took place. It's no secret that Putin is banking on Trump's victory. If this does happen, the US would likely erupt in chaos for a few months, giving Russia the perfect opportunity to start creating artificial border conflicts around the Suwalki Gap. In no time, deadly riots would break out, and what do you know, Russia has no choice but to intervene, just like it did in Ukraine in 2022. This, quote, intervention would require more troops and equipment to be sent to the Suwalki Gap. The German war plan puts that total figure to 70,000 troops in Belarus alone, together with 2 tank divisions, a mechanized infantry division, and a deployable headquarters just outside of NATO borders. This time NATO would be the one that has no choice. The alliance would have to approve the measures for credible deterrence in order to prevent Russia's invasion of the Baltic states and Poland. These measures would likely involve sending at least 300,000 troops to the area, including 30,000 Bundeswehr soldiers. Though this move was meant to be a deterrent strategy, it would likely result in the all-out war we keep mentioning in this video. This means that a major war in Europe could start as early as 2025. Despite NATO distancing itself from this war plan, it seems the alliance is well aware of the possibility. That's why NATO's annual military exercises have gotten bigger than ever. So let's talk Steadfast Defender 2024. Steadfast Defender, taking place from January 22nd to May 31st, 2024, is NATO's largest military exercise since the Cold War. These exercises started back in 1951 as a way to train and test the alliance's newly created military structures. From the very beginning, they involved multiple nations, helping NATO build an integrated military force under a centralized command. Throughout the Cold War, NATO also began testing the alliance's ability to rapidly deploy troops to Europe, which is what Steadfast Defender aims to achieve. The last exercise of this type and scale started in 1969 and continued annually until 1993. The exercise in question is Reforger, short for Return of Forces to Germany, and it has 125,000 participating military personnel. Steadfast Defender might have lasted significantly shorter, but it managed to gather nearly as many soldiers. As many as 90,000 troops from all 32 NATO allies took part in Steadfast Defender 2024, 20,000 of whom came from the UK, 15,000 from Poland, 10,000 from Germany, and 5,000 from the Netherlands, among others. These troops represented all military branches: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Special Operations Forces. Besides troops, Steadfast Defender boasted an impressive number of military equipment involved. We're talking over 80 air platforms, including the F-35 Lightning II, F/A-18 Hornet, F-15 Eagle, Harrier, helicopters, and drones. Over 50 ships, including aircraft carriers, destroyers, frigates, and corvettes. And over 1,100 combat vehicles, including 533 infantry vehicles, 417 armored personnel carriers, and 166 tanks. Talk about a display of military power. This display took place in Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states, allowing it to meet all its goals. But what goals are we talking about? Number one is ensuring the alliance can secure the Euro-Atlantic area. That's what the first phase of Steadfast Defender focused on. The phase in question involved live maritime exercises and amphibious assault training in the North Atlantic and Arctic seas. The phase started with the U.S. forces departing from Norfolk, Virginia, the home of NATO's Joint Force Command, followed by the departure of the Canadian forces from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Number two is ensuring the alliance can quickly reinforce its eastern flank in response to any potential aggression. That's what the second phase of Steadfast Defender was for. It involved multi-domain exercises across Europe, focusing on the rapid deployment of troops and equipment within NATO borders. One such exercise is Sabre Strike 2024, organized under the umbrella of the Steadfast Defender. This large-scale field training exercise took place in the Baltics and aimed to train NATO forces for rapid deployment in cold weather conditions. Speaking of cold weather, we must mention the Nordic response exercise taking place in Norway to enhance the Allies' ability to secure the High North. This crucial exercise involved 20,000 troops, over 50 ships, and over 110 aircraft from over 14 countries. The importance of the alliance's ability to defend every inch of the NATO territory can't be understated, and that's precisely what the brilliant jump test held in Germany and Poland trains the NATO response force to do. Poland also hosted the Dragon 24 exercise, whose goal is to train the Polish land, air, and maritime forces to respond to various military and non-military threats. This exercise involved 20,000 NATO troops from 10 different countries, 15,000 of whom were from the Polish armed forces. In terms of equipment, Dragon 24 used 3,500 pieces of equipment. The sheer scale of Steadfast Defender sent a clear message: NATO is more united and determined than ever. This next phase for the alliance should be demonstrating the willingness to proportionally respond to the Russian hybrid warfare attacks. This way, NATO will show Russia that it can beat it at every front. But this desirable outcome certainly won't come easily. It will require Herculean efforts from NATO countries, industries, militaries, and just as importantly, people. And that's why a portion of the NATO's military committee meeting in Brussels, which brought us the declaration of a future all-out war against Russia, was used to discuss how the countries can prepare for this imminent war. According to Admiral Rob Bauer, the chairman of the military committee, two factors will play the most important role in these preparations: the industrial base and the people. As far as the industrial base goes, it's simple. NATO countries must ramp up weapons production to ensure they can defend the national front first and foremost. The war in Ukraine has drained the stockpiles of weapons and ammunition of most NATO countries, making it imperative to boost production to replenish supplies. After all, this replenishment can take years, and as things stand, we don't have years to act, especially when Russia has fired up its war machine like never before, drastically speeding up its weapons manufacturing. Okay, this takes care of the weapons, but who's going to wield these weapons? That's where the second important factor comes into play: the people, or the mobilization of people, to be more precise. If an all-out war breaks out, a large number of civilians will have to be mobilized to support the war effort. NATO countries must, 1, be aware of that, and 2, put a system in place to manage the mobilization process. This is especially important when you consider the fact that most NATO countries have issues with the number of their troops. Take the UK as an example. As of January 1, 2024, the UK Armed Forces consists of 183,130 soldiers, 77.6% of which are regular personnel and Gurkha personnel. The remaining 17.8% is the volunteer reserve personnel. Compared to 2023, these numbers are down 3.7%, and the 2023 numbers were already down 3.9% compared to 2022. The Royal Navy might have it the hardest. Believe it or not, 2 warships had to be decommissioned in order to staff a new class of frigates. That's how few sailors there are in the UK. These and similar scenarios are causing more and more calls for mandatory conscription to bolster military ranks. Some NATO members like Latvia have already done so, while others are seriously considering the move. The UK, for instance, will bring back mandatory national service after 60 years if the ruling Conservative Party wins the national election in July, as promised by the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. But top NATO officials emphasized another important task for people living in NATO countries, even if they aren't mobilized. They must prepare themselves for war, both mentally and physically. Physically, this preparation includes preparing emergency kits with essentials like non-perishable food, water, medical supplies, and other necessities, such as a battery-powered radio to stay informed and a flashlight to navigate in dark during power outages. It seems that the Swedish people have already started assembling these kits, as there was a dramatic spike in sales of these devices after Sweden decided to join NATO. Though, to be fair, the spike probably has to do with a rather clumsy attempt made by the Swedish government to prepare their people for war. The Swedish Minister for Civil Defense, Carl Oskar Bolin, was quite direct concerning the matter. There could be war in Sweden. This declaration was followed by a rather ominous campaign on social media, sending a clear message: war is coming. Needless to say, these 3 simple words backfired rather spectacularly. Panic buying of war necessities ensued. Teenagers overwhelmed support hotlines in the country. Social media was flooded with doomsday scenarios. So much so that the Swedish government was eventually forced to apologize for scaring and possibly scarring children. But as aggressive as the campaign was, it had a 100% correct premise. We will all have to accept a new reality sooner or later, and as things are going, the sooner scenario seems like the more plausible one. Do you agree? Do you see an all-out war breaking out between NATO and Russia anytime soon? And if so, when? If, however, you're more optimistic about Europe's future, please do share your reasons why in the comment section below. We could all use some optimism in a time fraught with danger, instability, and insecurity. Now, go check out if NATO and Russia go to war, who loses, hour by hour, or click this other video instead.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is ready to end the war in Ukraine. That's the message 4 unnamed Russian sources delivered to Reuters on May 24, 2024. According to those sources, Putin is open to negotiating a ceasefire with Ukraine that would see the current battlefield lines essentially become a new border between the countries. Russia would control everything on its side of the front lines, including the Ukrainian territory it's already taken, while Ukraine would get to keep what they've managed to defend. 3 of Reuters' sources have even said that Putin is frustrated at the lack of peace talks. He believes the West is attempting to prevent a ceasefire from being negotiated, presumably to serve its own ends, while Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has also repeatedly said that he will not hold peace talks with Putin. All of this leads us to an obvious question: why? Why is Putin apparently so ready to open ceasefire talks now after he's spent over 2 years bombarding Ukraine? Before we dig into that question, it's important to point out that Reuters sources believe that a ceasefire is far from the only option Putin is floating. As one of them puts it, Putin can fight for as long as it takes, but Putin is also ready for a ceasefire to freeze the war. Putin himself has suggested the same thing. When quizzed about the Reuters reports while in Belarus, Putin said, "Let them resume," in regards to the peace talks, but there was a caveat. He also added that any negotiation should be based on the realities on the ground and can't proceed on the basis of what one side wants. Those realities on the ground may bring us to the first reason why Putin is ready to talk. He thinks he's taken enough territory. We can look to the BBC for insight into how significant those gains have been. In a May 2024 report, it released a series of maps to show how much Ukrainian territory Russia either controls outright or at least partially controls. It points out that Russian forces have managed to cross the international border separating Belgorod and Kharkiv, Ukraine's second-largest city, to make what some analysts call tactically significant advances. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, says that Russia has managed to take several northern areas around the city of Vovchansk, which includes the town's hospital, as well as taking territory inside Staritsya. Vovchansk hasn't been taken yet, but if Russia were to secure it in a ceasefire agreement, it would bring the border between Russia and Ukraine down to 45 miles away from Kharkiv, not enough to take Ukraine's second city, but close enough to make that city an obvious target should Russia decide to relaunch the war at a later date. Still, even here we see where disputes would likely arise if ceasefire talks were opened. While Russia would claim these territorial wins, Ukraine would claim that it's been stabilizing the situation around Kharkiv. Russia's 30,000 troops in the region are supposedly conducting fewer operations, though Putin could claim that's simply because they're preparing a larger operation that would see them breach the city. A point of contention arises that could stall the talks. More substantial is the territory Russia currently controls in Ukraine's east. Putin now controls much of the Donbas region, which includes several tactically significant positions. He holds Luhansk, Donetsk, and Mariupol, as well as having recently taken the fortified town of Avdiivka. The latter territory is especially important as it could provide Russia with a route deeper into Ukraine, as well as give it a defensive position it can use to prevent Ukrainian troops from advancing into Donetsk. To the southwest of Donbas, Russia also holds Melitopol. Then there's Bakhmut. On May 22, 2024, Russian media outlets began reporting that Moscow had captured Bakhmut. Comparisons to Russia's capture of Berlin during World War II were made, signifying how important this victory appeared to be in Moscow. Russian media was also quick to restore the city's former Soviet name of Artyomovsk, with one Russian anchor saying the myth that Artyomovsk is an unassailable fortress has been crushed. For the record, Ukraine claims that the fighting in the city isn't over. But if Russia has captured Bakhmut, it's as important a victory as taking Avdiivka. The city represents another position Russia can fortify, as well as another potential route deeper into Ukraine. The message Putin would want to send in any ceasefire negotiations becomes clearer. Russia is slowly taking Ukrainian territory. Surrender that territory now, delivering it fully to Russian control, and Ukraine will be able to prevent further advances. Any territory gained in the country's north would be a bonus for Moscow, though not essential when compared to keeping what it's gained in Ukraine's east. This would be a massive blow to Ukraine. According to the Washington Post, Russia now controls more Ukrainian territory than Ukraine managed to liberate during its big 2023 counteroffensive. This means that Ukraine will be negotiating from a worse position than it had last year. Worse yet for Ukraine, it appears to be struggling to hold several other positions on its eastern front. This was revealed in a May 2024 Reuters article, which quoted Alexander Kozachenko, a Ukrainian gun commander, talking about his unit's ammunition struggles. Earlier in the war, Kozachenko's M777 howitzer fired off 100 shells per day toward Russian positions. Now, it's a luxury if we can fire 30 shells. All of this adds up to a great reason for Putin to want to negotiate a ceasefire. Russia has taken a lot of Ukrainian territory, and he'd be able to negotiate from a position of power, knowing that it will take time for Ukraine to shore up its forces with the billions in aid pledged to it by several Western nations earlier in 2024. But there's also a problem for Putin. While he controls a lot of Ukrainian territory, he doesn't control any regions in their entirety. Even in Donbas, where Russia has made its most significant gains, any border drawn along the current battle lines would split that territory in two. That might not be acceptable to Putin. He might instead argue that Russia should control all of Donbas, a condition that Zelensky would almost certainly refuse. Still, it's easy to make the argument that claiming the territory Russia currently holds would be reason enough for Putin to want a ceasefire. But there are others, with one of the biggest being that Putin believes that ending the war now, claiming the territory Russia controls in the process, would be enough for him to claim he's achieved victory. That's according to two of Reuters' sources. They both say that Putin has the view that Russia's gains in the war so far are enough to sell a victory to the Russian people if the war were to end today. Sell is the key word there. After all, Putin began the war because he essentially believes there's no such thing as Ukraine. To his mind, it isn't an independent country, at least not anymore, and what we know as Ukraine is actually Russia. Putin made this claim in the years before the war, including in his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Published on the Kremlin's website in July 2021, the essay asserts that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, a single whole. He also says this is an assertion he's made many times, as well as a belief that is unfaltering. The rest of the essay provides an extended history lesson, albeit one colored by Putin's personal viewpoints, to reinforce his argument. He also argues that Ukraine was never a separate nation, with the country instead having been dragged into a dangerous geopolitical game aimed at turning Ukraine into a barrier between Europe and Russia, a springboard against Russia. Here, Putin reveals how he sees Ukraine and, by extension, how he wants his people to view the country. It is Russian land co-opted by nefarious Western forces to weaken Russia, meaning Ukraine has never actually been an independent state. It's simply a puppet for those who would oppose Russia. Ending the war now would allow Putin to sell his people on the idea that the war made great territorial gains. He could claim that he has weakened the barrier between Russia and Europe, dealing a blow to the West, and likely NATO in particular, through that weakening. He could even leave his people with the impression that Russia could go back to destroy the barrier entirely, taking full control of Ukraine in the future. Stopping now would not mean conceding. Russia has gained territory, Putin could point out, which is nothing more than a victory in terms of his view that the territory was Russia's to begin with. Whether the Russian people would buy what Putin's selling is another question. But by making the pitch, Putin would reveal another one of the reasons why he's looking for a ceasefire. Russia is slowly losing its appetite for the war. In truth, there's always been a large element of Russian society that never wanted to go to war with Ukraine in the first place. That's demonstrated by a June 2023 BBC report, which points out that anywhere between several 100,000 and several million Russians have left the country since the beginning of the war. Many have fled to Georgia and Kazakhstan, with others making asylum claims in Western countries like France and Germany. The consensus, according to the BBC, is that those who are leaving either have ideological differences with the concept of war against Ukraine or are simply attempting to escape Russia so that they won't be drafted into the country's army. Putin is also having to deal with deserters. In April 2024, the Kyiv Independent reported that more than 18,000 troops that were part of Russia's southern military district had abandoned their posts. It also highlighted that around 12,000 of that 18,000 are part of the 8th Combined Arms Army, which the news outlet says is often deployed into hostilities in eastern Ukraine. Of those deserters, 10,000 were mobilized conscripts, essentially soldiers drafted into the war, while the other 2,000 were contracted soldiers. That doesn't paint a pretty picture for Putin on the morale front. However, it would also be easy to argue that reports in the Kyiv Independent could be Ukrainian propaganda, especially as these figures come directly from Ukraine's military intelligence agency. That could be the case were it not for the other sources reporting similar issues. For instance, Novaya Gazeta reports that Get Lost, an organization that helps prospective deserters escape from their armies, claims that the number of Russian deserters requesting its services increased tenfold in January 2024. It says 28 soldiers deserted the Russian army via Get Lost in January 2023. That number was up to 284 the following year, with 50% of those desertions being contracted soldiers, with another 30% being recently mobilized reservists. Putin has attempted to combat these desertions. Russia introduced a harsh 10-year prison sentence for deserters during the war in an effort to stop people from running away. It's gotten so bad that some Russian soldiers purposefully injure themselves to avoid military service. That's according to a former Russian officer named Ivan, who now lives in Kazakhstan. He claims that not only did he give his soldiers extended leave on several occasions while knowing that many would never return, but that Moscow's harsher punishments have only led to Russian soldiers taking more desperate measures to escape. Running from the front lines is very dangerous, he says. People are fully aware that there are criminal consequences, but that doesn't stop them. Some pretend they are one of the dead or injured. Some shoot themselves in the foot to get out to a hospital and then escape from there. It's no surprise that so many Russian soldiers are deserting. They're dying at an alarming rate in Ukraine. That's according to the UK Defence Journal, which says that British intelligence officials believe that more than 450,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded since the war began. For context, Russia entered Ukraine with a fighting force of between 120,000 and 160,000, meaning it has experienced 50% more casualties than the number of troops it initially sent into the country. Those soldiers are also seeing enormous amounts of Russian equipment getting destroyed. Around 7,700 tanks have gone up in smoke, along with 10,000 armored vehicles. The Black Sea Fleet is at about 2/3 of its original strength thanks to Ukrainian attacks, and Russian artillery systems are being destroyed at a rate of around 800 per year. It all adds up to a war that's showing Russia's people that they're not able to easily defeat a much smaller nation. And this is creating a massive morale problem. That problem isn't being aided by the sheer amount of money Russia has spent on the war. Reuters reports that Russia has likely spent at least $211 billion on equipping and deploying its troops between February 2022 and February 2024. It's also lost around $10 billion to cancelled arms sales. All of this is set against a backdrop of increasing poverty in the country. That may come as a surprise to those who've read that Russia's poverty rate is falling. According to Statista, the fourth quarter of 2023 saw Russian poverty levels drop to 9.9 million people living below the poverty line, the lowest they've been for over 3 years. So how could there be a poverty problem in Russia, or at least a problem that's become worse since the Ukraine war began? The answer is that Russia has tweaked the way it measures poverty levels. That's according to a July 2023 article published by The Insider that says Russia previously measured its poverty levels based on food prices. It doesn't anymore. Instead, it measures poverty by assessing relative values in each of its regions, tweaking its formulas to include what it calls regional coefficients. For instance, the Tula and Tambov regions have a regional coefficient of 0.83, which is Russia's way of saying that it believes living expenses are lower than the national average, so the people there can afford to be paid less. What's the result of this tweak? According to The Insider, 2.3 million people who would have fallen below Russia's poverty line based on its previous method are no longer considered to be in poverty. This might create a situation in which those who are clearly still in poverty now see billions being spent on the military while being told that their own living situations aren't as dire as they believe them to be. Putin will be taking notice of all of this. He recognizes that extending the war in Ukraine is risky from a popularity perspective. He may have recently won a presidential election with a landslide victory, even if the validity of the election can be disputed, but even he knows that he needs to bend to the will of his people to some degree. By being open to declaring a ceasefire, albeit one on Russia's terms, he can tell his people that he's actively seeking peace. If he's successful, he not only ends the war while being out to claim victory, but he also prevents millions of Russians from becoming further disillusioned with him and the government he's running. That brings us to another reason why Putin might be looking for a ceasefire. Taking even more territory in Ukraine would likely force Putin to enforce a new wave of military mobilization. Mobilization would create even deeper morale problems inside Russia. According to Radio Free Europe, the September 2022 partial mobilization, which enabled Russia to call up around 300,000 soldiers, triggered tens of thousands of Russians to flee the country. Unfortunately for Putin, that initial mobilization may not be enough to enable Russia to defeat Ukraine. It's gaining territory, as highlighted earlier, but it now faces a Ukraine potentially reinvigorated by new financial and military aid flowing into the country. To take more territory would require more troops to replace those being lost. That's why the Kremlin is now considering plans to announce a new wave of military mobilization. Russia would draw a further 300,000 people out of its population to serve as soldiers on the front lines, ensuring that it has the manpower needed to make further gains if the war continues. However, that proposal comes with a problem. An increasing number of Russians don't want to see a second military mobilization take place. Again, Putin will be well aware of this lack of appetite for mobilization. His September 2022 mobilization led to a definite popularity decrease in Russia, with a Levada Center survey carried out in the immediate aftermath finding that only 53% of Russians believed that Putin's special military operation was going to plan. That was down considerably from the 73% who said the same thing in May of 2022. The Levada Center's survey also found that 47% of Russians were anxious, scared, or horrified by the Kremlin's decision to mobilize, with a further 13% saying they were angry. Only 23% said they felt proud of Russia. That lack of appetite carries through to a potential second round of mobilization. According to the Atlantic Council, an examination of a range of polls conducted in Russia shows that between 50% and 60% of Russians reject the idea of a second wave of mobilization. Perhaps that's why Putin has been slow to follow through on plans for doing it. More mobilization would damage his support in his homeland. It also hints at many in Russia not believing in his cause. Putin likely hoped that his claims that Ukraine is Russian territory, and thus that Russia should fight to reclaim it, haven't been met with the numbers of volunteers his military needs to continue his special military operation. That's why he's been forced to mobilize. A second wave of mobilization might be so damaging to him that declaring a ceasefire would be a far better alternative. That would allow Putin to not only position himself as the victor of the war, but would also let him claim that he's done everything in his power to return Russia's soldiers home. If Zelensky refuses to negotiate, he could use that to paint Ukraine's president as the person forcing Russia to send more people into Ukraine. Either way, Putin wins. Still, it's not just the Russian people's opinions that should cause Putin enough concern that he's ready to end the war. It's also the support Ukraine is receiving. In April 2024, the United States approved a $60 billion aid package to Ukraine. That package goes alongside many others from Western nations, adding even more billions in equipment and financial support to Ukraine's coffers. The immediate issue for Russia is that this aid will help Ukraine bolster its defenses and possibly launch counterattacks against Russian positions. The loss of territory that could result would mean any victory Putin declares in a ceasefire would be diminished. Better to declare that victory now than risk losing territory. However, the approval of this and other aid packages also shows that Western nations are growing increasingly wary of Russia and its ambitions. Putin may sense that there's a shift in attitude, with some nations no longer believing that his special military operation will end in Ukraine. It could go further. Several NATO members have already indicated that they will be willing to offer more direct support to Ukraine to defeat Russia. February 2024 saw France's President Emmanuel Macron claim that the possibility of NATO, or at least France, sending soldiers into Ukraine couldn't be ruled out. Macron hasn't backtracked on those statements, even as the rest of his NATO allies claim this isn't a possibility. May 2024 also brought an indirect statement from David Cameron, the UK's Foreign Secretary, that seemed to indicate that Britain would be fine with Ukraine using British-supplied weapons to strike Russia. As Cameron put it, just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself. Moscow called this a very dangerous statement that risked escalating tensions between Russia and NATO. That escalation is the last thing that Putin wants. Though Russia can always make the nuclear threat and has done so on several occasions during the war, Russia's failure to secure Ukraine quickly demonstrates that its military is perhaps not as fearsome as many believed. That military is also depleted, meaning Putin would ideally want to spend time rebuilding before any real conflict with NATO could begin. Hence his openness to a ceasefire. Not only would Putin be able to claim a victory and reinforce his position in Russia with that ceasefire, but no longer fighting in Ukraine could help him to de-escalate tensions with NATO. Those tensions would still exist, of course, and Europe in particular will be wary of Putin's intentions in the immediate aftermath of a ceasefire. But Putin could at least say that NATO has no justification to attack Russia if there's peace in place between Moscow and Kyiv. All of these reasons combined could explain why Putin may be ready to end the war. Unfortunately for Putin, it's likely that a ceasefire isn't going to happen. That's partially due to Zelensky and his refusal to even consider the possibility of a supposed peace that would see Ukraine cede large portions of territory to Russia. Speaking to the Wall Street Journal in July 2022, he said, "The territories must be liberated first, and then we can negotiate about what to do and how we can live in the centuries ahead." His stance hasn't changed in the nearly 2 years that have followed. In 2023, he told reporters that he would not be willing to participate in any negotiations mediated by Turkey, noting that he'd asked to start those types of discussions before a full-scale war was declared. Putin wouldn't negotiate then, and Zelensky would refuse to negotiate now. As the Ukrainian put it, Putin is not the same man. There is nobody there to talk to. And Zelensky again reinforced his position in a discussion with The Economist in January 2024. It's also notable that both Russia and Ukraine have refused to call a ceasefire for the 2024 Olympic Games in July. To Putin, these are the actions of a stubborn man who refuses to come to the table, a picture of Zelensky he may paint to the Russian people. But the reality is that Putin's desire for any negotiations to reflect what's happening on the ground is his way of telling Zelensky that he would have to cede vast swathes of Ukrainian territory to achieve peace. This wouldn't be a two-way negotiation, and Zelensky knows it. For him, it's better to continue fighting, especially with the international support Ukraine has, because that at least presents him with a better chance of keeping Ukraine whole than any ceasefire would. It's also worth noting that Putin's actions don't align with his supposed openness to a ceasefire. In February 2024, Reuters reported that the United States rejected Putin's ceasefire overtures, with the outlet reporting that Putin had contacted Washington through intermediaries in the Middle East to say he was open to talks. The problem was that Putin was unwilling to cede any of the territory Russia had gained up to that point, a position that hasn't changed with these latest suggestions that he's ready to end the war. The US refused, in part, because it didn't want to have to pressure Ukraine into giving up territory to end the war, according to one Russian source. However, another potential reason could be that the US, along with most Western countries, doesn't believe that Putin's ceasefire would result in peace. After all, Putin has denounced the Ukraine Peace Summit scheduled to be held in Switzerland in June 2024. That summit could see several countries come together in a bid to impose conditions on Russia to end the conflict, according to Putin himself. He also claimed that Russia wasn't invited to attend, allowing other countries to cast aspersions on Moscow for not sending a representative when they haven't been allowed to send one. Both are logical points that show Western nations that Putin isn't interested in any kind of ceasefire that doesn't benefit Russia. So Russia and Ukraine are at an impasse. Putin may have expressed a desire to call a ceasefire. That ceasefire would allow him to claim victory and territory and will also let him avoid a second military mobilization in Russia. However, it would come at a great cost to Ukraine, meaning Zelensky and his allies are unlikely to agree to the conditions upon which Putin would insist if they ever did come to the table. But what do you think? Are there other reasons why Putin might want to declare a ceasefire now? Is there a possibility that he will be willing to cede any of the territory Russia has captured to end the war in Ukraine? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out how the US and UK's aid package to Ukraine will destroy Putin. Or click this other video instead. Ukraine has been on a knife edge in its war with Russia over the last year. During that time, it's been forced to confirm that its counteroffensive, which was designed to push Vladimir Putin's troops back, had failed, and it's been gradually losing territory to the Moscow steamroller. Russia has been taking ground. Avdiivka represents perhaps the largest victory for Putin over the last year of the war. The city, which Ukraine had transformed into a fortress, fell in 2024 after Moscow committed wave after wave of attack beginning in October 2023. Putin hailed the taking of Avdiivka as being hugely important for Russia, not least because controlling the city means Ukraine loses its main route into Donetsk. Along with that victory, Russia has made some serious inroads into Bakhmut, as well as taking several villages around Zaporizhia. Some commentators say there's now a stalemate on the front lines. That's not the case. Russia is advancing thanks to its ability to constantly bombard Ukrainian positions with artillery and troops. The war of attrition has been playing out in Putin's favor, not least of which because he has the funds to support his war effort at a time when Ukraine has started to run low. But that's all changed. And with that comes the possibility that Ukraine could be on the verge of destroying Putin's ambitions. All of which brings us to the key questions we'll answer in this video. What's the seismic change that's happened that will allow Ukraine to finally push back against Russia? And perhaps more crucially, what does this mean for Putin's ambitions not just in Ukraine, but the rest of Europe? The answer to the first of those questions is simple. Both the United Kingdom and the United States have approved massive aid packages that are going to be a major help to Ukraine in the months to come. We'll start with the UK's package. On April 23, 2024, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak travelled to Poland for a meeting in which he aimed to strengthen the country's security ties with one of Europe's emerging military nations. During that meeting, he announced that the UK had approved a £500 million, approximately $620 million, aid package that would account for the country's largest ever delivery of military equipment to a wartime ally. The announcement brought the UK's funding total in Ukraine up to $3.7 billion for the financial year, with most of the money going toward funding equipment that Ukraine desperately needs to fend off the Russian offensive. Among that equipment will be 60 boats, including raiding craft, dive boats, and maritime guns that can be used both to fend off any Russian naval offenses as well as provide Ukraine with options for making inroads into Russian-controlled territory in Ukraine. The UK will also provide 400 military vehicles split between 78 all-terrain vehicles, 160 Husky vehicles, which come with protective armor, and a further 162 armored vehicles of different types. Plus, the UK will bolster Ukraine's missile stocks. The money will pay for 1,600 air defense and strike missiles that may help Ukraine deal with Russia's constant bombardments. Add to that a small number of Storm Shadow long-range guided missiles, which are capable of traveling for about 150 miles, providing Ukraine with the ability to strike Russian targets from a great distance, and you have a comprehensive equipment package. And that's not all. The UK will also provide Ukraine's ground soldiers with 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition, as well as support from its engineering industry. There's also mention of supplying drones in the press release announcing the aid package. The UK's Defence Secretary Grant Shapps was bullish when speaking about the package, pointing out that the UK was the first to provide Ukraine with modern tanks, long-range missiles, and NLAW anti-tank missiles. Now we are going even further. We will never let the world forget the existential battle Ukraine is fighting, and with our enduring support, they will win. Those are big words. But as impressive as the UK's aid package may be, alone it would not be enough to turn the tide of war in Ukraine's favour. At best, it would give Ukraine enough ammunition to defend itself for a few more months, but more is needed for Ukraine to stand any chance of destroying Putin's hope of taking the country. Enter the United States. After months of political wrangling, the US Senate has finally approved a massive $95 billion aid package. Signed and sealed by President Joe Biden, that money will go to supporting Israel, Taiwan, and Ukraine, with the latter getting the lion's share of the funding. According to the BBC, it's expected that $61 billion of that money will be dedicated to providing military aid to Kyiv, making the package about 10 times the size of that being delivered by the UK. The package has been a long time coming. As Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer pointed out, after more than 6 months of hard work and many twists and turns in the road, America sends a message to the entire world: we will not turn our back on you. Defense One offers more details on how Ukraine will likely spend the money. It says that $13.7 billion will go to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which works on behalf of Kyiv to procure new weapons. Another $1.6 billion will go to a similar weapons acquisition scheme, the Foreign Military Financing Program, which is overseen by the US State Department. Add to that $13.4 billion that will be used to replace weapons the US has already sent over that have since been lost in the war, along with funding for further training of Ukrainian troops, and you have a substantial aid package, albeit one that comes with a few strings attached. Those strings include provisions in the bill that the US can withdraw the funding if Ukraine doesn't spend the money in a way that the US sees as fitting. That seems unlikely. America is already working closely with Ukraine in terms of how it spends the funds, with most of it being dedicated to purchasing American equipment that Ukraine needs anyway. Ukraine can deal with that. It's also important to point out that Ukraine isn't getting all of that money, or the equipment that it will buy, in one go. Defense One says that the first tranche of weapons the US will send to Ukraine under the new aid package will have a total of $1 billion, about a 60th of the total aid. The package is likely to include anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, along with 155mm shells, armored vehicles, and long-range rockets. Unfortunately, there are no specific numbers at the time of creating this video, though it's safe to assume they'll be somewhat similar to the UK's. And there's more. Along with finally passing the bill for aid to Ukraine, the US House of Representatives has passed another bill that could be just as damaging to Putin. A bill that allows the US to seize Russian assets held in American banks before transferring them to Ukraine for its war effort. That bill still needs to make it through the Senate, but if it passes, it would represent a bold move by the United States that could see it free up around $67 billion in assets that would essentially double the aid package it's sending to Ukraine. That bill could also serve as a trigger for other nations to do the same. After all, the $67 billion in frozen assets that the US holds is just a fifth of the $300 billion plus of frozen assets held around the world. According to Russia's central bank, Moscow has around $207 billion invested in the euro, along with $37 billion invested in the British pound. There are also tens of billions of dollars invested into the Japanese yen and Canadian and Australian dollars. Imagine what would happen if the nations controlling these currencies all followed America's lead. Ukraine would suddenly have access to over $300 billion of Russia's frozen money, which it could use to fund its defense. Of course, Putin has been quick to call any type of seizure illegal and has threatened retaliation if it happens. So the fact that the US even has a bill at all, never mind one that's passed through the House of Representatives and seems to have support of key Republican Party players, suggests that the wider world is ready to take a more aggressive approach to dealing with Putin's attempts to take Ukraine. And that brings us neatly to the second question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why does the renewed aid the United Kingdom and the United States providing to Ukraine spell such bad news for Putin? There are several answers to this question, starting with the most obvious one. The aid bolsters Ukraine's defense at a time when Russia has been slowly pushing it back in a devastating war of attrition. Right now, Russia controls around 18% of Ukrainian land, which it's managed to gain by virtue of having more equipment and manpower. That equipment advantage has come to the fore in Russia's reliance on constant missile and drone barrages over Ukrainian cities, which are supplemented by its ability to send soldier after soldier into the fight with seemingly no sign of letting up. That strategy is unlikely to change in the short term. In 2024 alone, Russia has already captured 138 square miles of Ukrainian territory, and if Ukraine's defense intelligence heads are to be believed, is planning to launch a renewed offensive at some point during May 2024. That offensive will likely focus on the small town of Chasiv Yar in Donetsk. That would be bad news for Ukraine, because the capture of that town would open the way to Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, two Ukrainian strongholds in the Donbas region. Chatham House also believes it's likely that Putin will intensify Russia's missile and drone strikes, focusing on Ukrainian infrastructure, logistical routes, and industrial base. All have suffered in recent months from a lack of air defenses, and it's here where we may see the tide start to turn. As part of its aid package, the United States is supposedly providing a Patriot missile defense system to Ukraine. with that system being capable of shooting down many of the types of missiles that Russia will use in these attacks. Germany has also committed to sending one, with Greece and Spain also facing increasing pressure to transfer their Patriot systems to Ukraine. Add to that the money Ukraine can now access, which it would use to purchase more Patriot missile systems, along with the ammunition they require, and the country is now in a better position to defend itself against missile strikes. Why is that such bad news for Putin? It's possible that Russia might start running low on missiles if it has to start firing more to achieve the same results it enjoyed before Ukraine got access to these new Patriot systems. Back in January 2023, Ukrainian intelligence officers started to suggest that Russia was running low on its ballistic missile stocks. A Ukrainian Air Force official named Yuri Inat suggested that Moscow had fewer than 100 of its Iskander missiles left due to its repeated strikes throughout 2022, forcing it to rely on its weaker S-300 and S-400 systems. The S-300s date back to the days of the Soviet Union, making them less reliable than their supposedly dwindling modern alternatives. Their use, suggested Inat, meant that Russia must be running low on ballistic missiles. But that was over a year ago, and the barrages kept coming. Still, it highlights the equipment and munitions challenges both face in what has become the modern example of what industrialized ground warfare looks like. According to Reuters, Russia has already fired 8,000 missiles, along with sending 4,630 Shahid drones into Ukraine. It's making and buying more, but that rate of use will eventually mean Moscow starts to run low, with Ukraine being aided by its new missile defense systems to put an even more severe dent in Moscow's missile stockpiles. In short, Putin may not be able to rely on his missile barrages for as long as he would have done without the aid packages. And given that those packages include supplying Ukraine with more missiles of its own, he may also find that the ground Russia has already taken in the country could be subjected to the very same missile strategies he used to take that ground in the first place. But Putin has a workaround for that problem, one he's already been using to great effect in Ukraine: glide bombs. In an interview with the UK's Times radio station, Professor Michael Clarke, a fellow of King's College in London, discussed Russia's use of these bombs. Specifically, he highlighted the Fab 500 and Fab 1500 variants, which are capable of carrying warheads weighing 1,102 pounds and 3,306 pounds respectively. These are very old bombs. They're not equipped with the precision-guided systems that modern missiles have, though their payloads are so massive that it doesn't really matter. As long as Russia can drop the bombs in proximity of their targets, they don't need direct strikes. The bombs can still cause damage. Clarke points out that Moscow has found a way to fit small wings to these bombs, giving them the ability to glide towards a target after being dropped from an aircraft. That's been huge for Putin. One of Russia's planes can drop a glide bomb from 30,000 feet in the air while being 50 miles behind the front lines and still know that it's likely to hit its target. The bombs were crucial to Russia's taking of Avdiivka. According to Le Monde, one Ukrainian fighter said, "These bombs completely destroy any position. All buildings and structures simply turn into a pit after the arrival of just one KAB, a term used for the glide bombs. And they drop 60 to 80 pieces on us in just one day," the soldier concluded. Countering those bombs is going to be a huge challenge for Ukraine. The only thing Ukraine can really do, according to Clarke, is take out or chase off the Russian planes that are dropping the bombs in the first place. That's where the Patriot systems may come into play again, as their range is such that they can target and hit Russian planes stationed 50 miles behind the front lines, potentially taking them out of the game before they can launch their deadly payloads. Again, another huge boon for Ukraine. If it's able to get its hands on more fighter jets, the Netherlands will provide it with 6 that were previously meant for sale in the US, as of a February 2024 report. It could even take the fight to those bomb-dropping planes. These are all little steps. And given that the funding is staggered, as well as Ukraine having to wait for equipment to arrive before it can deploy it, it's likely that Russia will still manage to advance in the near term. But with the new defensive systems in place, Ukraine can stem the bleeding and potentially take advantage of Russia's munitions starting to dry up at a key point where it's receiving a fresh load of weaponry and equipment. Ukraine will also be able to counter the glide bombs, albeit only partially, reducing their effectiveness on the battlefield to the point where Ukraine can hold its cities for longer. And that ability to hold for longer is another reason why the UK's and America's aid packages could destroy Putin's ambitions. It will lead to Russia losing more soldiers. In his interview, Clarke highlights that Russia is still losing around 900 soldiers per day to a Ukraine that is war-weary and running out of equipment. It's been able to sustain those losses because of the sheer size of its army. According to Global Firepower, Russia ranks 5th in the world for active military personnel with 1.32 million, and it has 2 million reservists along with 250,000 paramilitary members. Moscow won't run out of people anytime soon. Its problem comes in funneling those huge numbers into Ukraine, which has become a slightly easier task now it controls territory in the country. But even with that territory, losing 900 people per day is a massive burden. Now that Ukraine has enough money to purchase more artillery shells and small arms ammunition, its ground troops will be able to kill even more of Putin's soldiers. That doesn't necessarily mean Ukraine will be able to force a counterattack with this funding, according to Clark. But it does mean that Russia will be forced to sustain higher losses than it has over the last few months, potentially weakening its hold on territory it's taken during 2023 and the first part of 2024. In short, Ukraine now has what it needs to start pushing Russia back, and that gives Ukraine two things that it hasn't had in a long time: breathing room and the ability to plan for the future. Now that it's better able to fend off attacks, Ukraine's frontline forces won't be in the state of panic and chaos that Russia has placed them under for much of 2024. They'll be able to launch coordinated attacks with the equipment to back them up, as well as better coordinate their defenses against Russian assaults. Clark speculates that this could slow down the Russian advance to the point where the war returns to the stalemate position it seemed to be during the beginning of 2023, giving Ukraine valuable time to plan how to use its new resources both to defend and attack. As for the control issue, Ukraine now has stability in terms of knowing what's coming in and where. It knows that the UK is going to deliver 60 boats, 400 vehicles, and 1,600 missiles, with that knowledge allowing it to plan ahead on how to maximize that equipment rather than being in a position where it has to constantly scramble to react to Russian attacks. The same will go for America's military aid package. It all feeds into giving Ukraine more control in the conflict and buoys the morale of troops that have been seeing their supplies constantly dwindling over the past year. That's not what Putin wants. As Clark points out in the Radio Times interview, Putin's strategy has been to slowly put the squeeze on Ukraine by forcing it to face up to what felt like insurmountable odds. He knew Ukraine was running low on equipment. All he had to do was keep pushing, slowly but surely, perhaps to the point where he could force a political crisis in the country. That crisis may have been the ousting of Ukraine's president Volodymyr Zelensky and opening the door to a new leader who was sympathetic to Putin's ambitions. A leader who might hand over the territory Russia has already captured to keep the peace. That's not going to happen anymore, at least not for the next year, according to Clark. He highlights these new aid packages could restore Ukraine to the point where it's again able to expend the 10,000 artillery shells it was using to keep Russia at bay near the beginning of the war, creating a stalemate situation again right as Russia looks set to push deeper into Ukraine. Clark believes that Putin thought that the aid packages, particularly the one from the United States, wouldn't get through the Senate. Now he faces a situation where Ukraine has a renewed flow of supplies that will increase troop morale and could lead to Russia's soldiers facing a much harder fight than they faced for the last year. Does that mean Putin will be forced to leave Ukraine? Not necessarily. But there's another element to this aid package that is huge for the potential outcome of the war and may play the biggest role in destroying Putin's ambitions. It's a sign that the rest of Europe is waking up to the threat that Russia poses. Take the UK as a perfect example. When speaking about the country's most recent $620 million package, Rishi Sunak made it clear that the package represented the UK getting on a war footing for the first time in decades. The aid pledge came with another that would see the UK increase its defense spending to 2.5% of GDP, amounting to around $93 billion over the next 6 years, with Sunak calling it the biggest strengthening of our national defense for a generation. He went on to point out that the world is the most dangerous it's been since the end of the Cold War, while warning against taking a complacent approach that would see Russia take Ukraine and potentially turn its attention to other European countries. The country also intends to invest around $12 billion into ammunition production, likely as a result of having seen Russia's tactics in Ukraine. There are signs of the British war machine starting to activate elsewhere. Beyond sending aid to Ukraine, the UK has also announced that it intends to deploy some of its Typhoon fighter jets to Poland, giving Poland more options when it comes to policing its skies. It's not outside the realms of possibility that those jets will be there to keep an eye on what Russia does should it take Ukraine. After all, as AP News points out, Poland has already seen Russian incursions into its airspace since the war in Ukraine began. Even more worrying for Putin is that it's not just the UK that's on notice. The rest of Europe is quickly figuring out that the Russian war machine might target them next. Before the UK and the US announced their aid bills, the EU had agreed to send $53 billion in financial support between 2024 and 27. Rather than being dedicated to funding military equipment, the EU said the money could be used to keep the country's administration running. More bad news for Putin, as well as paying for salaries, pensions, and public services. So there's funding coming from two fronts, military and civilian aid, that could strengthen Ukraine in its fight against Russia. America's substantial aid package also places pressure on many European countries to follow suit with packages of their own. Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia have contributed massive amounts already, with the latter having committed 1.5% of its GDP to Ukraine, with Estonia and Lithuania committing 1.8%. Germany is delivering a Patriot system to Ukraine, as mentioned earlier, with the country already having established itself as the biggest supplier of military aid to Ukraine behind the United States. And of course, we have France's President Macron talking about the possibility of sending NATO troops into Ukraine to fight Russia is still on the table, even if the rest of NATO's leaders claim that's an impossibility. These are far from the only examples, but all prove that Europe is increasingly concerned about Putin's ambitions, both for Ukraine itself and for the rest of the continent, should he succeed in taking Ukraine. Again, that's not what Putin wanted. His invasion of Ukraine was meant to be a smash and grab. The country was supposed to roll over in a matter of months, accept that it would become part of Russia, and the rest of Europe would just have to deal with it. Instead, Ukraine has held on. It's now being buoyed by financial aid that will allow it to fight for another year, and Putin is having to watch as the rest of Europe mobilizes production, while committing even more money to Ukraine, so it'll be ready to fight if Putin turns his attentions beyond Ukraine. It all adds up to Russia potentially losing steam in Ukraine. Putin has already responded by threatening to increase the rate of missile strikes in Ukraine in response to America's aid bill passing. Through his defense minister Sergei Shoigu, Putin said that Russia will increasingly target storage bases and logistics centers for Western weapons in response. Russian propaganda has also started the nuclear weapons conversation again, with Newsweek reporting on April 29th that state TV channel Russia 1 news anchor Dmitry Kiselyov has talked about Russian nuclear launches on the air. He said that if NATO troops enter Ukraine, Russian nukes would not only disarm France in an instant, a clear shot at Macron, but would target American decision-making centers. Those words may not come directly from Putin, but they come from a prominent figure on Russian state-sponsored television, meaning we can assume Putin approves. And as Clark concludes in his interview with Times Radio, the renewed threats of nuclear war could be a sign that Russia is worried. It knows Ukraine is going to get a heavy injection of military equipment, and that injection may just be a heavy enough dose to stop the Russian war machine in its tracks. But what do you think? Could the announcement of financial aid from the UK and the US help Ukraine to turn the tide in the war? Is it all a case of too little too late? And is Putin genuinely worried about the rest of Europe mobilizing in the wake of his invasion? Are his plans going to come crumbling down? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video. After the fall of Avdiivka in February 2024, French President Emmanuel Macron stated that the West should do everything it could to make sure Russia does not prevail in Ukraine. He pointed out that past taboos, like sending long-range missiles to the Ukrainian military, had already been broken. Therefore, the West should not rule out potentially putting boots on the ground. Macron, who called the meeting where he made these remarks, represented a nation whose higher-ups are increasingly worried about the Russian economy's transition to a wartime footing. To the French, such a transition and its contribution to renewed Russian effectiveness on the battlefield greatly threatens the security of Europe. Europe would therefore need to see to its defense and the maintenance of a first-rate domestic defense industry. As part of this broader security focus, France is rearming again and bidding to reclaim the place it had occupied for centuries, the most powerful military state on the European continent. In this video, we will look at France's arms buildup and what its efforts mean for Europe's broader defense posture. Despite its reputation, France has long been a large military spender in Europe. Even in the period of peace after the end of the Cold War, France never fell far below NATO's 2% benchmark. Its lowest military expenditure between 1991 and 2022 was 1.8% of GDP. In January 2023, Paris announced it would increase military spending by more than a third between 2024 and 2030. The result is that the military budget would have doubled since President Macron came to office in 2017. In addressing this new increase, Macron acknowledged that the post-Cold War era, which he called a peace dividend, had come to an end. The new military spending, he said, will be designed to make France a forward-thinking military, capable of being one war ahead. Major investments in the new build-up would include drones, cyber warfare, and intelligence. The strategy would be one designed to fight a peer or near-peer conflict as opposed to the asymmetric operations France has long taken part in on the African continent, which mostly involve rapid skirmishes and counterinsurgency operations with low-level firepower. France is currently ranked as the world's 11th most powerful military in the Global Firepower Index. It has a 200,000-strong active-duty army with an additional 26,000 in reserve and 150,000 paramilitary personnel. It has a robust air force with 972 total aircraft. 224 of these are fighters, 118 are transports, 140 are trainers, 44 are special mission planes, 17 are tankers, and 447 are helicopters, 69 of which are of the attack variety. On the ground, France is a lot more vulnerable. It only has 222 active tanks, and not all of them are ready to be deployed. It has over 85,000 other military vehicles, but only 96 self-propelled artillery units, 9 multiple launch rockets or MLRS systems, and no towed artillery units. These rankings were current as of January 2024. This comparatively small stockpile is a big problem for the French and Europe, as the war in Ukraine has revealed how rapidly these assets can be destroyed in a peer or near-peer conflict. Russia's tank losses have been notorious, but even at the height of its effectiveness in the summer and autumn of 2022, Ukraine was still losing 2 tanks a day, which would only give the active French tank fleet a few months before depletion. To address these deficiencies, France began a 20-year military modernization program called Project Scorpion, which began its concept phase in 2010 and officially launched in 2014. That date was no coincidence, as it marked the start of the troubles in Ukraine. Russia's actions back then signaled to Paris that the post-Cold War peace dividend might be on its last legs. The next year, France reversed its trend of budget cuts to its military and began to spend more on defense. In 2016, the French government pledged $6.7 billion over the following 11 years as part of the Scorpion program. A major part of this program is to modernize France's tanks and vehicles. Project Scorpion set out to upgrade 200 Leclerc main battle tanks as the centerpiece of its vehicle-centric focus. Additionally, there are ongoing upgrades to over 1,800 Griffon armored personnel carriers and 978 Serval vehicles. New procurements have been part of the armored build-up too, with France setting out to acquire over 2,000 new Serval VBMRL vehicles, 625 new VBCI infantry fighting vehicles, and 300 new EBRC Jaguar armored reconnaissance vehicles. The Jaguar was introduced into service in 2022 and is a major improvement over the earlier AMX-10RC and ERC-90 Sagaï vehicles, which are steadily being retired. The Jaguar is a good choice not only for reconnaissance, but also as a fire support platform. Its 40mm cannon, MPP anti-tank missiles, and remote-controlled 7.62mm machine gun are well suited to making it a mobile firepower unit. It also has smoke grenade launchers to help protect it from enemy fire. It has a top speed of 90 km/h and a range of 800 km. The Jaguar is cheap, and it saves expenses on both of the earlier vehicles it replaced, and it uses the same chassis as the VBMR Griffon, which in turn is based on a commercial truck chassis. Although the price of €1 million was the original intent, the vehicle's sophistication and enhanced capabilities led to a unit price of approximately €5 million. Many of the parts needed for the Jaguar can instead be adapted from civilian sources. The Jaguar is therefore capable but also easily replaceable in a peer or near-peer conflict, making it ideal for France's new focus on high-intensity, state-based warfare. The upgrades to the VBMR Griffon have the same idea in mind. All of the Project Scorpion upgrades and new acquisitions have been done under the operations of a consortium of French companies. Such a move was meant to ensure a robust domestic defense sector. The companies involved in this initiative included Nexter, Thales, and Renault Trucks Defense. The first 689 of the new Serval VBMRL vehicles are expected to enter service by next year. As mentioned, military intelligence capabilities are a key part of the Scorpion buildup. Specifically, France seeks to emulate the data-sharing attributes of the United States Armed Forces, which allow unprecedented interoperability of arms to destroy targets as needed. For example, an F-35 fighter jet could use its stealth qualities to penetrate an enemy air defense zone and find a target of opportunity. But rather than giving away its position by opening its internal weapons bay to fire a missile, it can call upon a cruise missile strike from a ship at sea or an artillery strike from a HIMARS system hundreds of miles away, sharing the precise coordinates of the enemy through its unprecedented sensor fusion and situational awareness. Although ground forces are not quite as capable, France is looking to increase its vehicles' situational awareness. This part of Project Scorpion is called Combined Collaborative Combat. As an example, the Jaguar is loaded with sensors and electronic warfare measures. It has an Antares missile alert system that has 360-degree coverage and the Thales Barge, an active jamming device that interferes with improvised explosive devices. There is also an acoustic sensor mounted to the roof to spot enemy gunfire. This is called the Metrovy Pilar V. The Antares system will also be equipped on the upgraded Leclercs and Griffon APCs. Providing the new vehicles with improved situational awareness will help to create a smarter military, capable of sharing data between branches and creating something like a French kill web. An example might be a Jaguar using its sophisticated sensors to approach an enemy attack position. This would normally be dangerous, but the accurate data it will provide would then be sent to air or artillery support to wipe out the enemy tanks and move on to the next task. This is the way in which more lightly armed American soldiers in Iraq were often able to get the better of Iraqi tank units. So France's new vehicles, while not being quite as capable as those of the United States, will still provide intelligent, powerful, and reliable platforms for its armed forces. They will also be far more replaceable, meaning that the French economy would not need to spend years retooling for a war in order to make them producible at the scale needed to deal with the attrition rate of a peer-based battlefield. In contrast, vehicles like the US Army's Stryker infantry carrier require much more specialized parts that will be difficult to produce in a peacetime economy. Aside from its hardware upgrades and new procurements, Project Scorpion aims to enhance interoperability between the armies of Europe. For example, Belgium has cooperated with France in producing the Jaguar, and it too operates the vehicle. In 2019, Belgium announced it would buy at least 60 Jaguars and 382 Griffons. This makes cross-training and shared logistics between the two countries easier. Indeed, Belgium has cooperated with France in supporting and operating the vehicles. In 2021, Luxembourg was assessing whether it too should join France's Project Scorpion. For President Macron, this inter-European cooperation is an essential part of his strategy for France. Years before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, he was one of several prominent European policymakers urging the necessity of a security posture for Europe that was independent of the United States. To him, while American cooperation and the NATO alliance remains essential, Europe needed to do more to create a stable security framework through its own actions, especially given the turbulent domestic politics in the United States and a shifting foreign policy focus in Washington. European countries, in other words, could no longer afford to be the free riders that President Obama and Trump had accused them of being. The war in Ukraine and dwindling American support as its presidential election year ramped up spurred his comments in February 2024. "We cannot wait for the outcome of the American elections to decide what our future is going to be. It's the future of Europe that's at stake, so therefore it's up to the Europeans to decide. If others want to join in and help, fantastic, but that's just an added bonus." Macron insisted that Europe must take the lead in supplying Ukraine with badly needed ammunition and must further buttress a domestic defense industry. He supported Estonia's idea for the European Union to issue defense bonds for such a purpose, although the Germans and Dutch are so far resistant to this proposal. The expansion of Project Scorpion to include other countries in Europe would be a natural evolution of this philosophy. France has already fielded a Scorpion modernized brigade and plans to field its first Scorpion modernized armored division next year. However, the French have no plans to stop with Project Scorpion. More recently, Paris has announced a second phase of the broader military modernization push, a phase it calls Project Titan, which was launched in 2018. While Scorpion largely focused on France's fleet of lighter vehicles, Titan's primary objective will be to modernize and better equip the country with heavier instruments of war, such as tanks, artillery, helicopters, and aircraft. Titan's primary objective is to deliver the necessary combined arms equipment for high-intensity, state-based warfare as part of an all-aspect approach to warfare. According to Charles Baudouin, a retired general in the French army who led Scorpion in the technical section, Titan will aim to aggregate the lower-intensity experiences seen in the War on Terror with the higher-intensity type of warfare seen in Ukraine. Strategies to counter anti-access area denial systems are a big part of Project Titan, and France is carefully studying how this A2AD environment might evolve before it makes big purchases. As the action in Ukraine has revealed the importance of rapid infantry response and situational awareness via drones, Paris is likely pleased with the emphasis of the earlier Project Scorpion, and a new push to make capable drones is natural. France is also well aware that these lighter, more mobile forces have defeated heavier units such as tanks through the use of systems like portable anti-armor weapons and even commercial drones armed with anti-tank grenades. A study of these emerging realities will influence the purchases and improvements of heavy equipment under Titan. The emphasis on situational awareness and data sharing seen in Project Scorpion will be continued in Titan. As part of this focus, the French Army is working with the Procurement Office to create a high-capacity data network set to enter service after 2040. In May 2022, Arnaud Goujon, a colonel in the French army who was attending a conference on land weapons hosted by France's Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique think tank, described the effort as a strategy of simultaneity. He mentioned that Titan was not just about platforms, in other words, it was about software as much as hardware. Extending a combat cloud for the country's ground forces is a way to follow up on Project Scorpion's drive to deliver lighter and medium vehicles to the French military and further improve their situational awareness. As part of this, the French plan to use a next-generation communication system that calls on metadata and is enhanced with artificial intelligence to speed up data sharing and decision-making. All Project Scorpion vehicles will be upgraded with the breakthroughs that Titan produces, enabling an extension of their service life, which is important because even the new Jaguar will be entering the middle of its ordinarily expected service life by the time Titan updates are all finished. Titan partially aims to cover the gaps that Project Scorpion will leave in its wake once it's completed. One of the bigger gaps in Scorpion was the relative lack of defense against anti-tank missiles and drones. The French brass also expects the new Titan-produced vehicles to come with intelligent robotics, at least in a few cases. Once the French brass gets a complete review on the demands for heavy equipment on the modern battlefield, Project Titan plans for a number of hardware upgrades. The centerpiece of these upgrades will be a successor to the Leclerc tank, which has been in service since the early 1990s. Details are sparse as to whether this is officially a part of Project Titan, but France and Germany have been collaborating on a new tank since at least 2018. Back then, the Leopard's manufacturer, Germany's KMW company, and France's Nexter Defense Systems, which makes the Leclerc, collaborated to produce a hybrid of the two tanks and demonstrated their capacity to work together. France and Germany have decided to create a next-generation main battle tank under the moniker of Main Ground Combat System. The two countries intend to replace their respective main battle tanks with the product of the MGCS by 2040. In 2018, Janes noted that the date could be moved up a few years because the collaboration between the two countries was already well advanced. There are also reportedly unmanned systems to go along with the new tank. The two countries are also working on a new artillery project called the Common Indirect Fire System. This will be a self-propelled howitzer which will replace France's CEASEFIRE and Germany's PZH-2000. This new artillery is expected to enter service by around 2035. In building the new artillery system, Titan will draw on two European Union studies on future artillery systems. These are the Future Indirect Fires European Solution (FIRES) and the European Common Long-Range Indirect Fire Support System (ECOLORS). These studies each got a budget of almost $4 million and are expected to be completed this year. FIRES will look at potential next-generation 155mm artillery shells and rockets, while ECOLORS will consider an improved European 155mm cannon and whether this and a rocket launcher can be mounted on a hybrid truck. The French are looking to the skies as well, hoping that Titan will create a next-generation helicopter to replace the Tiger, which came into service in the 1990s. Project Titan also aims to create a replacement for the Mistral 3. The Mistral is a family of short-range air defense missile systems that can be deployed from vehicles, ships, helicopters, and even in a portable configuration. Development of this system began in 1974 and it entered service in 1989. The Mistral 3 boasts better imaging processing abilities and enhanced engagement against targets that have minimal heat signatures, such as drones, turbojet-powered missiles, and fast attack craft at distances up to 7.5 kilometers. The Mistral 3 is also resistant against electronic warfare countermeasures. The Titan replacement will presumably improve on these attributes. It will be a mobile, ground-to-air, low-altitude system. Baudouin claims that Project Titan aims to offer total superiority by 2050. Obstacles remain for the project, however. For example, it's unclear if the MCGS project will go off without a hitch. The potential for the French and Germans to reduce their level of cooperation in the face of pressures from competing interests from other companies who want a place at the table remains. These are companies such as Germany's Rheinmetall and Krauss-Maffei-Wegmann, who have expressed their intention to be part of the new tank project. Rheinmetall is also working on its own new tank, the KF-51 Panther, which it began developing in 2016. It plans to target Leopard operators for sales of this tank. Meanwhile, another competing tank, the Enhanced Main Battle Tank, might also threaten the MCGS. This vehicle is manufactured by the aforementioned KNDS. Both companies would naturally like to see their projects prevail over the MCGS idea. Nevertheless, France is banking that Project Titan will successfully enhance its military capabilities. Paris is confident enough that it's looking even further into the future than Titan. Perhaps this is because of the ongoing success of Project Scorpion, which has generally delivered its ambitions on time and on budget. Looking further ahead, there's also Project Vulcan, which invests heavily in cyber warfare and will attempt to make the French army compatible with modern robotics by 2040. Another part of the war in Ukraine that France has tried to internalize is the renewed power of defensive armaments and the role that new technologies held by civilians plays on the modern battlefield. For example, civilians equipped with smartphones and drones can help to transmit the locations and movements of armed forces to other parties, threatening operational security. Finding answers to these challenges will be an important part of France's broader military buildup. Despite its reputation in some segments of popular culture, the French military has remained a capable and experienced fighting force. However, the war in Ukraine has driven home key vulnerabilities in Paris's arsenal and approach to warfare, especially in vehicles, drones, and artillery systems. France has seen no choice but to adapt to modern geopolitical and military realities. France was long Europe's leading military power. Now, with the United States increasingly focused on countering China in the Indo-Pacific region and its uncertain domestic politics making its commitment to European security less clear, Paris once again aims to take up the mantle and create a momentum that will allow the rest of the continent to follow in its wake. If Project Scorpion, Titan, and Vulcan succeed as intended, the French will be on their way to fielding a fighting force that will not only serve Paris's needs, but have a chance to serve as the pivot of European military affairs, as it had generally between the 14th and 19th centuries. But will these projects succeed as Paris and President Macron intend? Don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments. Also, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts. Now go and check out how the German military will become Europe's most powerful, or click this other video instead.